Hello, and welcome to the Snoozy Scientist. I'm really glad you made it here tonight. Wherever you are on this vast and beautiful planet, this little pocket of calm was made just for you, a quiet space where science and stillness can rest side by side, carrying you gently toward sleep. Tonight, we're going to drift back 252 million years ago into one of the darkest and most haunting chapters in Earth's story. Scientists call it the Great Dying, and for good reason. People often think the asteroid that ended the age of dinosaurs was the greatest extinction in history, but compared to this, it was almost nothing. The Great Dying is the single worst mass extinction in all of Earth's long history. Nothing else even comes close. 9 out of every 10 living things vanished. Entire forests collapsed into ash. Oceans suffocated until they turned black. The skies burned red, and rivers turned to poison. It was, without question, the deadliest day the world has ever known. But what chain of disasters could have caused such devastation? Why did almost nothing survive? And most haunting of all, how did the fragile few that clung to life eventually give rise to us? Tonight, we'll step carefully into that ancient apocalypse, layer by layer, to get the full picture of Earth's deadliest chapter. If you're already settling into this peaceful moment, it would mean the world if you gave this video a gentle like, maybe even subscribed. If you'd like more sleepy science stories like this one, and if you'd be kind enough, let me know in the comments where you winding down from tonight, and what time is it there. I love watching our bedtime map light up, one dreamer at a time. So now, take a slow breath, let your shoulders soften, and together, let's begin the story of the deadliest day in Earth's history. Let us drift back now before the catastrophe, before the skies turned red and the oceans went black, to see the world as it once was. The time is 252 million years ago, in an age scientists call the Permian. It was a world both strange and familiar, both teeming with life and balanced on a delicate edge. Across the planet stretched a single giant landmass, the supercontinent we call Pangaea. Imagine standing at its center. There are no separate continents, no scattered islands, only one vast expanse of land joined together. From one horizon to the other, deserts stretch endlessly, hot winds whip across cracked earth, and the summers burn with a heat few creatures can bear. Deep inland, far from the cooling reach of the sea, rain rarely falls. The air itself tastes dry, sharp, and bitter. Yet along the edges, where the land meets the ocean, the picture softens. There, fertile coastlines bloom with lush forests, rivers wind across plains, and green stretches out as far as the eye can see. It is a world of extremes, harsh deserts in the heart of Pangaea, but abundance along its edges. In these fertile zones, the land is alive with creatures unlike anything you would recognize today. Reptilian predators, sharp-toothed and scaled, lurk in the undergrowth. They are not dinosaurs, not yet, but their distant ancestors. Their bodies are lean and angular, their eyes sharp, their movements quick and deliberate. Alongside them walk the mammal-like reptiles, a strange and fascinating group that bridges two worlds. They look reptilian with their scales and sprawling limbs, yet in their jaws and bones, scientists see the first whispers of what would one day become mammals. Some are fearsome hunters, stalking through fern-filled forests, while others graze on low shrubs with blunt teeth built for chewing. If you could stand in their presence, you might recognize faint hints of what would one day be familiar, a warm-blooded ancestor hiding inside a reptilian shell. The forests themselves are thick with towering conifers and seed ferns. Their branches stretch high, blotting out the sunlight in deep green canopies. The air is heavy with the scent of resin and damp leaves. On the forest floor, smaller plants cluster, creating a rich world where insects buzz and early beetles scuttle across bark and soil. Dragonflies with wingspans wider than your hand hover above pools of still water, their translucent wings shimmering as they catch the sun. Step beyond the land and into the oceans, and life appears even more abundant. The seas are alive with creatures both ancient and alien. Coral reefs build vast underwater cities, dazzling in color and home to countless smaller species. Trilobites, those iconic many legged survivors of earlier ages, still crawl across the seabed, though their reign is nearing its end. Ammonites drift through the water, their spiral shells gleaming as they twist and turn in the currents. Some are no larger than your palm, while others grow as big as wagon wheels. Their tentacles curl and unfurl with graceful precision, catching prey that drifts too close. Schools of fish flash silver as they scatter from predators lurking in the depths. Sharks, already ancient even then, prowl through the water, their sleek forms cutting through the waves with practiced ease. Crinoids, strange creatures that resemble flowers more than animals, sway gently with the tides, anchored to the ocean floor yet very much alive. If you could dive into these seas, you would see colors, movement, and forms that blur the line between plant and animal, predator and prey, familiar and alien. From land to ocean, life in the Permian had reached a peak of diversity. Creatures filled almost every available space, from the deserts to the coastlines, from shallow seas to the open oceans. Each niche had its specialists, each environment its rulers. On the surface, it seemed as though this balance could last forever, as though life had mastered every challenge the earth could set before it. But the balance was more fragile than it appeared, for while Pangaea thrived in some places, its sheer size created harsh conditions that left ecosystems vulnerable. Inland deserts stretched too wide, rainfall patterns shifted too dramatically, and the oceans, though rich, were sensitive to even the smallest changes in temperature and chemistry. Life carried on, unaware of the storm that was gathering beneath its feet, a storm that would soon sweep across every forest, every desert, and every sea, until almost nothing was left. If we linger for a moment longer in the world before the fall, we begin to notice something unsettling. On the surface, life appears abundant and confident, filling the seas, the forests, and the skies. Yet just beneath this beauty lies a delicate tension, a balance so fine that the smallest shift could bring it tumbling down. It is in this fragile balance that the seeds of disaster were sown. At the heart of Pangaea stretched a continent so vast it seemed endless. With all the land joined into one colossal mass, the middle of this supercontinent lay unbearably far from the life-giving seas. Without the steadying hand of the ocean to regulate its climate, the interior baked under scorching summers and froze under brutal winters. The air could be so dry that rain might not fall for months. Winds scraped across empty plains, carrying dust that choked what little vegetation clung to life there. Only the hardiest plants and the most resilient creatures survived in this inland wilderness, and even they did so precariously. In sharp contrast, the edges of Pangaea told a different story. Along the coastlines, the ocean's breath softened the seasons. Rivers fed fertile plains, and forests gathered in dense, dark canopies where life thrived in relative abundance. These coastal zones became havens, oases of green and water in a world that was otherwise harsh and unforgiving. Yet because so much of the land's richness was pressed to the margins, ecosystems were stretched thin. They crowded together, competing for limited spaces where the conditions were stable enough to support them. This imbalance created vulnerabilities that were not obvious at first glance. With such extremes between inland deserts and fertile coastlines, species became highly dependent on specific habitats. Animals that roamed too far inland faced barren ground and deadly heat. Plants adapted to narrow ranges of moisture and temperature, had nowhere else to grow if conditions shifted. The oceans, too, carried hidden weaknesses. While they were rich in life, they were shallow in some places and tightly bound to climate and chemistry. Even a modest change in temperature or a slight shift in rainfall patterns could ripple outward, placing strain on webs of life that seemed strong but were in truth already taut with pressure. Imagine standing on one of those coastal plains, gazing inland to the horizon. You would see the line where green gave way to brown, where forest shaded into emptiness. That line was the edge of survival, a narrow threshold holding back the vast deserts beyond. Any change that pushed that line a little further toward the sea would shrink the forests and strain the animals that depended on them. The predators would be forced to range wider for food, the grazers would find less to eat, and the balance that allowed so many species to live side by side would begin to wobble. On the seas, the balance was just as delicate. Reef systems flourished, but they relied on waters that were neither too warm nor too cold, neither too acidic nor too poor in oxygen. These conditions were maintained by cycles of climate and chemistry that had been steady enough for millions of years. Yet when a system rests on such narrow boundaries, even the gentlest nudge can bring it toward collapse. This was the hidden truth of the Permian world. Life had reached a peak of diversity, but it was a diversity spread thin across environments that were far less stable than they appeared. The grandeur of Pangaea, the very thing that made the planet look so mighty, also carried within it a silent fragility. With so much land exposed to desert extremes, and so much life crowded into narrow belts of stability, Earth was like a tightrope walker balancing carefully above a great drop. Each step was steady, each breath seemed calm, yet the danger was always there, waiting. And beneath this fragile world, deep in the crust of the earth itself, forces were stirring that would test the balance to its breaking point. As the world of the Permian thrived along its fragile margins, deep within the earth, something restless began to stir. Far to the north, in the land we now call Siberia, the ground trembled with quiet warnings. At first they would have been subtle, small rumbles underfoot, cracks forming in stone, the air carrying faint whiffs of smoke and heat. To the creatures of that time, these tremors were invisible whispers of what was to come, signs that forces older and more powerful than life itself were waking. The crust beneath Siberia split open. Magma that had been locked away for millions of years began to rise, pushing upward through layers of rock, searching for escape. When it finally broke free, it did so with a violence almost unimaginable. Vast eruptions tore through the surface, fountains of molten rock shooting skyward, glowing rivers of lava spilling out and racing across the land. Each eruption might have lasted days, weeks, or months, but together they built a fury that stretched on for hundreds of thousands of years. These were no ordinary volcanoes. The scale of what unfolded dwarfs anything modern humans have ever seen. The Siberian Traps, as scientists now call them, were not a single peak or cone. They were a province of fire, a whole region cracking apart and bleeding lava. Imagine entire countries swallowed by sheets of molten rock, spreading not for a few miles, but for hundreds upon hundreds. By the time the eruptions had run their course, lava fields would cover an area nearly the size of the United States. The land itself became a furnace, glowing and shifting, reshaping the very surface of the planet. The sound of these eruptions would have been deafening, the air filled with the roar of explosions as the ground split apart. Ash clouds rose like black mountains into the sky, blotting out the sun. Rivers of lava moved so slowly that animals could run from them, yet so relentlessly that there was no stopping their advance. Forests ignited on contact, turning instantly into seas of fire. The smell of burning resin and charred earth must have hung in the air for weeks. The first creatures to perish were those caught too close to the fissures, scorched by heat, or buried under fresh layers of molten stone. But even far away, the effects of these eruptions began to creep across the land and sea. With every burst, gases poured out alongside the lava, invisible at first but deadly in their reach. Carbon dioxide, sulfur, and chlorine hissed into the air, changing the atmosphere breath by breath. What began as local disasters soon reached far beyond Siberia. The eruptions pulsed in waves, one after another. Over years and centuries, they released volumes of lava that are almost beyond comprehension. Some individual flows stretched for hundreds of miles, hardening into dark basalt that still blankets Siberia today. To walk across it now is to step over the scars of that ancient firestorm, stones that once glowed orange and red as they poured like liquid from the earth's wounds. As the lava spread, the land transformed. Valleys disappeared under glowing floods. Rivers were swallowed whole, redirected, or sealed off by walls of basalt. Plains became jagged fields of black rock, still steaming as they cooled. From the perspective of life, these changes were sudden and violent. For creatures adapted to narrow ranges of climate and habitat, the shifting ground must have felt like the very floor of the world collapsing beneath them. But the surface destruction was only part of the story. The gases released by the Siberian traps began to seep into the sky in quantities no living creature had ever faced. At first, the changes were subtle, slow, and nearly invisible. The balance of the air shifted by fractions, then by degrees, yet those fractions would prove deadly. With every eruption, the atmosphere grew heavier with carbon, the oceans drew in more and more of it, and the stage was set for a chain of disasters that would spread across the globe. The first tremors in Siberia were not only the cracking of rock and the rising of fire, they were the quiet beginning of a sequence that would ripple outward, touching every desert, every forest, and every ocean. The world had been fragile already, its ecosystems stretched thin. Now that fragility met with fire, and the ground itself opened a door to a storm that would not end until life had been nearly erased. The fountains of fire in Siberia did more than scar the land. They also reached for the sky. Each eruption hurled clouds of ash and aerosols upward, higher and higher, until they spread like veils across the heavens. What had once been a clear blue dome began to fade into a haze of gray and black. The sun, steady for millions of years, became muted, its light filtered through curtains of volcanic dust. At first, the dimming might have seemed temporary, a passing veil of shadow over the land. But as the eruptions continued, the haze thickened. Ash fell like dark snow across forests and plains, coating leaves, clogging streams, and weighing heavily on everything it touched. Animals that breathed it in coughed and choked. Plants struggled to capture the weak rays of light that pierced through the murk. Each eruption added new layers of darkness, until daylight itself felt thin and fragile. The aerosols, tiny particles suspended high in the atmosphere, reflected sunlight back into space. The warmth that normally bathed the earth was turned aside, leaving the surface colder with each passing season. Temperatures dropped suddenly, not in slow shifts but in jolts that rattled ecosystems already stretched thin. Places that had once been warm enough to support lush vegetation found themselves gripped by unexpected chills. Crops that had grown for ages along fertile plains began to falter. Ancient seed ferns, which had thrived for millions of years, now withered under skies that no longer offered reliable warmth. For animals, these changes were bewildering. Grazers found the plants they relied on growing sparse and weak. Forests that had once provided shade and food became patchy and bare. The predators that stalked them began to starve too, for when the grazers faltered, so did everything above them in the chain of life. Even creatures that had survived the first lava flows now faced a different, more insidious enemy: hunger. The oceans too felt the reach of the darkened sky. Without steady sunlight, plankton at the surface weakened, and with them the foundation of entire marine food webs. Creatures that had drifted in abundance began to thin out, leaving emptier waters and hungrier predators. In shallow reefs, corals struggled to keep their symbiotic partners alive, their delicate balance upset by the loss of consistent light and the sudden cooling of waters. The contrast across the planet grew sharper. Some regions froze under volcanic winters, while others still burned at the edges of lava flows. The Earth became a patchwork of extremes: freezing nights, dim days, and seasons that no longer followed familiar rhythms. Rain patterns shifted wildly, sometimes flooding plains, sometimes vanishing entirely. Rivers, once steady, either swelled with sudden downpours or dried into cracked beds of dust. For the creatures living through it, there was no understanding of why. They could not know that gases and ash drifting far above their heads were blocking the very sunlight that sustained them. To them, the world simply seemed to turn against them. Herds of plant eaters roamed further in search of food that no longer grew. Predators fought over scraps. Small burrowing animals, once overlooked, found safety underground, while larger beasts struggled under the open sky. The smell of sulfur hung in the air, sharp and stinging, carried by winds that spread volcanic gases across continents. Acid droplets fell with the rain, biting into leaves and leaching nutrients from the soil. Crops of ancient plants failed silently, one by one, leaving behind skeletal forests where only a short time before life had thrived. The darkness did not kill quickly, but it spread everywhere, seeping into every corner of land and sea, giving creatures only the faintest taste of what was still to come. The planet, once alive with color and light, now looked bruised and dim. Skies glowed in eerie shades of red and gray as the sun struggled to pierce the haze. The stars at night blurred, hidden behind the drifting ash. Days shortened, shadows lengthened, and the rhythm of life itself faltered. This was only the beginning, a warning in the heavens that the world was slipping out of balance, a taste of death that whispered across forests, deserts, and oceans, even as greater catastrophes were gathering to follow. With the skies dimmed by ash and the air choked with volcanic fumes, the balance of the world grew even more unstable. Temperatures swung wildly, and with those swings came storms of unusual violence. Lightning cracked through the smoky heavens, its jagged flashes tearing across the darkened sky. Each strike carried enough heat to set forests ablaze, and the land, already weakened and brittle from drought and acid rain, was ready to burn. At first, the fires erupted locally, sparked in patches where lightning fell on dry branches and resin-filled trunks. But the flames spread quickly, racing through the dense coniferous forests that had once shaded the fertile coastlines of Pangaea. The air grew heavy with the sound of crackling wood and the roar of flames feeding hungrily on trees that had stood for centuries. Once the fires began, there was no stopping them. The conditions were perfect for chaos: forests dry enough to ignite instantly, winds strong enough to fan flames across great distances, and a sky already seeded with countless lightning strikes. The result was not isolated blazes, but firestorms, vast infernos that stretched across the horizon. Imagine standing in a Permian forest, surrounded by towering trees, and watching as the canopy above you explodes into a wall of flame. The heat would have been unbearable long before the fire reached you, searing the air, baking the ground, and forcing every creature to flee. Smoke billowed so thick that day turned to night, and the world glowed in shades of orange and red. Animals tried to escape, but there was nowhere safe to run. Herds of plant eaters stampeded through valleys and across rivers, driven by the scent of burning forests and the thunder of collapsing trees. Smaller creatures scrambled for burrows or hid in the shadows of rocks, but the flames leapt and spread faster than many could outrun. Predators that had once stalked calmly through undergrowth now fled alongside their prey, both driven by the same instinct to survive. Some collapsed in exhaustion before the advancing fires, their bodies consumed by the inferno that left nothing but ash behind. The forests that had stood for millions of years collapsed into charcoal. Trees fell one after another, their trunks split by heat, their branches collapsing as the fire devoured them. Entire ecosystems vanished in hours, reduced to smoldering wastelands where once there had been shade, shelter, and food. The insects that lived within the bark, the birds that nested in branches, the reptiles that stalked along the forest floor, all were swept away in the rolling tide of fire. The smoke from these burning forests joined the volcanic haze already blotting the sunlight. The skies thickened further, filled with soot and ash that circled the globe. With every new blaze, the air grew more toxic. Creatures that survived the heat of the flames still struggled to breathe, their lungs clogged with fine particles, their bodies weakened by constant exposure to smoke. Rivers and lakes nearby turned black with ash and falling debris. Water that had once sustained life now carried poison, suffocating fish and amphibians alike. Some fires were so immense that they created their own weather. Heat rising from the flames twisted the air into violent columns, pulling sparks and embers high into the atmosphere before scattering them miles away. New fires ignited where those embers landed, expanding the inferno beyond what any single storm could have created. These fire-driven winds roared like tempests, pulling trees from their roots and hurling debris across the land. The forests of Pangaea, already stressed by shifting climates and volcanic activity, could not withstand such relentless destruction. For the animals trapped in this burning world, every choice was deadly. Flee too far inland, and they faced barren deserts with little food or water. Stay near the coasts, and they risked being overtaken by firestorms or suffocating in smoke. Some tried to swim across rivers to escape, but many drowned as burning debris rained into the water. Even the seas offered little refuge, for the soot and ash falling into them poisoned the surface and blocked the sunlight needed for life below. In the aftermath of each firestorm, the land lay blackened and lifeless. Charred stumps marked where forests once stood tall. The ground itself seemed to smolder, releasing heat long after the flames had moved on. The silence that followed was eerie. No rustle of leaves, no calls of creatures, only the faint hiss of embers cooling in the wind. Yet above that silence, lightning still danced across the sky, ready to ignite the next blaze. The great firestorms did more than strip the land of its forests. They stripped entire ecosystems of their stability, removing the plants that fed herbivores, removing the shelter that protected small creatures, removing the very foundation upon which life on land depended. It was as though the earth itself was devouring its own surface, preparing the way for even greater calamities still waiting to unfold. The fires that swept across Pangaea left the land blackened, but the air above carried another hidden danger. With every eruption from the Siberian Traps, not only lava and ash were released. Invisible streams of sulfur and chlorine gases poured upward, rising into the atmosphere, where they mingled with clouds heavy with moisture. When those clouds drifted across the skies and the rains fell, the water that returned to the ground was no longer clean or life-giving. It had been transformed into acid. The first drops would have stung as they touched leaves and bark, leaving pale scars where they landed. As the storms grew heavier, the rain soaked entire forests, burning the surface of plants as if they had been splashed with poison. Delicate ferns curled inwards, their fronds eaten away by the droplets. Seed ferns, which had once dominated the Permian landscape, shriveled and blackened under the constant assault. Even the towering conifers, which had withstood harsh seasons and wildfires, began to weaken. Their needles turned brown, their trunks scarred, their roots no longer able to draw the same strength from the soil beneath them. The ground itself suffered as the acid seeped deeper. Nutrients that plants depended on were stripped away, washed out of the soil by the chemical storms. In their place, toxic metals rose to the surface, carried up from rocks as the acid gnawed into them. The earth that had once supported green canopies became barren and lifeless, a crust of leached minerals where even the toughest seeds struggled to sprout. Fields that had once fed herds of herbivores became empty stretches of dirt, their fertility stolen drop by drop. The rain carried its poison further still, into rivers and streams. Waters that had once run clear grew cloudy and sour. Fish that swam through them found their gills burned by the acidity, their bodies weakened until they floated lifeless to the surface. Amphibians, which depended on the balance of both land and water, were among the hardest hit. Their soft skins absorbed the toxins easily, leaving them vulnerable in every stage of life. Eggs dissolved before they could hatch, tadpoles twisted in shallow pools, adults gasped and failed as their habitats turned against them. Creatures that had once flourished along riverbanks, chirping and croaking in abundance, now vanished in silence. The runoff from the rain carried ash and soot from the firestorms down into the waterways, mixing with the acid and thickening the poison. Streams that once brought life through valleys now carved black scars through the land, filled with water too deadly to drink. Animals that bent their heads to quench their thirst found themselves choking instead, their mouths burned, their bodies collapsing beside the very streams that had once kept them alive. Even the seas felt the touch of this poisoned rain. Rivers emptied their acid burden into coastal waters, staining the shallow reefs. Corals, already struggling under dim skies and shifting temperatures, now faced another assault as the waters around them turned corrosive. The fine balance of chemistry that had allowed their growth for millions of years was undone, and their skeletal structures began to dissolve. Shellfish that relied on calcium to build protection against predators found their defenses weakening, their shells thinning until they cracked with ease. Above the land, the storms raged on. Clouds carried their corrosive cargo across vast distances, ensuring that no part of Pangaea remained untouched. The deserts in the interior may have seen little rain, but where it did fall, the soil was stripped even further, leaving nothing but dry, salted crusts. Along the coasts, the once rich belts of vegetation weakened day by day, unable to recover between each storm. The cycle was merciless, firestorms burning the surface, acid rain leaching what remained, rivers spreading the damage ever further. For the creatures that roamed these lands, survival grew harder with every passing season. Herbivores searched for plants that no longer grew. Predators searched for prey that no longer grazed. Insects, usually resilient in times of change, found their habitats collapsing as both water and soil turned hostile. Even the air carried the sting of sulfur, making every breath harsh and bitter. The sky that had darkened with ash now delivered not just shadow but poison. Every storm brought the memory of eruptions far away in Siberia, reminding the world that the disasters were not contained to the land of fire. They spread through air and water, seeping into every living space. What had begun with trembling ground and fire now fell from above, drop by drop, transforming life's most essential gift into a steady rain of death. As the poisoned rains carved through the land and rivers carried their black burden to the seas, another transformation was quietly taking place. The gases released by the Siberian eruptions did not remain only in the skies. Much of the carbon dioxide poured downward into the oceans themselves, dissolving into the waters that had sustained life for hundreds of millions of years. At first, the changes were invisible. Waves still rolled against the coastlines, and from the surface, the seas looked calm and endless. Yet within, their very chemistry was shifting. Oceans have always acted like a great lung for the earth, breathing in carbon from the air, holding it, and then releasing it again in delicate cycles. But when the balance tipped too far, when too much gas entered too quickly, the water began to turn sour. The pH levels dropped, and the seas grew more acidic than they had been in countless ages. Creatures that had never faced such conditions found themselves in waters that no longer nurtured them, but instead slowly dissolved them from the outside in. Coral reefs, which had built sprawling underwater cities across the shallow seas, were among the first to suffer. These reefs were made from calcium carbonate, fragile skeletons assembled over countless generations. In normal seas, they were strong, vibrant, and filled with color, hosting fish, shellfish, and swarms of invertebrates that lived among their branches. But as acidity rose, their structures began to weaken. The fine frameworks of coral polyps, which had held firm against storms and predators, started to crumble. Piece by piece, the reefs that had glowed with life disintegrated, collapsing into chalky rubble. The bustling cities of the oceans fell silent. For marine creatures that relied on shells, the threat was equally relentless. Clams, snails, ammonites, and countless tiny plankton all built their defenses from calcium, drawing it from the waters around them. But now the chemistry of the seas stripped that calcium away before it could harden. Shells grew thinner, more brittle, sometimes failing to form at all. A snail that once carried a spiral fortress now carried only a fragile film, vulnerable to the slightest touch. Ammonites, with their graceful coiled shells, found their protection dissolving, their once sturdy armor becoming delicate and porous. Even the smallest creatures at the base of the food chain, plankton that secreted tiny calcium plates, saw their defenses vanish, leaving them exposed in waters that had turned against them. As shells weakened, predators found easier meals, but the feast did not last. When shellfish faltered, when corals collapsed, entire ecosystems began to unravel. Reefs that had provided shelter to schools of fish could no longer protect them. Open waters that had once been alive with plankton began to empty. The foundation of marine food webs, the invisible scaffolding that supported life in the seas, was quietly eroding. The oceans themselves changed in other ways too. Acidic waters absorbed sunlight differently, creating strange, muted hues beneath the waves. The clear blues that had once shimmered across shallow coastlines darkened, taking on gray and murky tones. Sea grasses that had anchored the shallows faltered as their roots struggled in waters that no longer supported them. Crinoids, those delicate animals that looked like flowers swaying on the seafloor, lost the firm grip of their stalks, their bodies weakened by the dissolving chemistry around them. Imagine swimming through those seas as the changes unfolded. The water would sting at gills and skin. Fish would glide more slowly, their movements sluggish as oxygen slipped from their blood. Ammonites would drift clumsily, their shells cracked and pitted, their tentacles less precise than before. Small clams and snails would lie half buried in the sand, their shells eroded and broken, unable to protect the soft bodies inside. Every current carried the weight of chemical change, and every creature that breathed or drank from the sea felt its sting. The damage spread relentlessly, carried by currents across vast distances. From the coasts of Pangaea to the deep reaches of ancient ocean basins, the acid waters reached everything. No corner remained untouched. The seas that had once been the richest refuge for life now turned hostile, their chemistry twisted, their balance undone. Life had nowhere to hide. And as the waters grew sour, another danger began to rise silently within them. The oxygen that had once filled the oceans began to thin, leaving stretches of water suffocating and still. Darkness and poison spread together, preparing the seas for a silence deeper than any they had known before. As the oceans grew more acidic and their chemistry twisted against the creatures within, another change was quietly building in the depths. Beneath the seabed, locked inside frozen lattices of ice, lay enormous reserves of methane. For millions of years, these hydrates had rested, stable under the weight of cold and pressure, sealed away in the dark. But the world was warming, not gently or slowly, but with the sudden push of volcanic gases pouring endlessly into the sky. The seas that had once kept these hydrates solid began to heat, and in that warming, a new catastrophe was awakened. The seafloor groaned as the frozen cages of methane hydrates began to break apart. At first, the release was slow, small bubbles rising like ghostly lanterns through the water, drifting to the surface where they escaped into the air. But the trickle became a flood. Great pockets of methane tore free all at once, boiling upward in torrents of invisible gas. The seas frothed and hissed as plumes burst from the depths, carrying with them a power far greater than the carbon dioxide that had already poisoned the skies. Methane is a greenhouse gas many times more potent than carbon dioxide. In small amounts, it can warm a planet quickly, but in the volumes released during the Great Dying, it became a bomb. The Earth, already shaken by the weight of eruptions, poisoned rains, and acid seas, now faced an atmosphere supercharged with heat-trapping gas. Temperatures that had wavered between hot and cold, with each volcanic pulse, now surged upward in a relentless climb. The change was swift. Within a geological instant, the Earth's surface grew hotter by more than 10 degrees Celsius. In regions near the equator, the heat became unbearable. Days baked the land so fiercely that even shade offered little relief. Nights no longer cooled enough for recovery, and the cycle of exhaustion spread across every creature exposed to the open air. The forests that had survived fires and acid rain now struggled under relentless heat, their leaves curling inwards, their roots searching for water that no longer flowed. For animals, the air itself became a trap. Some reptiles attempted to adapt by burrowing or retreating to shaded valleys, but many simply collapsed in the rising temperatures. The line between livable and lethal shifted with terrifying speed. Habitats that had once been fertile became ovens, their life driven out in a matter of seasons. Herds of herbivores that had roamed the coastlines weakened and died, leaving predators to wander hungrily across empty plains. In the oceans, the sudden warming was just as brutal. Currents that had once flowed steadily began to falter. Layers of water mixed less, trapping heat near the surface while the depths grew stagnant. Creatures that had endured the acidic waters now faced temperatures that pushed them beyond their limits. Fish grew sluggish, corals bleached into pale ghosts, and shellfish that had clung to survival finally failed as the seas grew too warm to support them. The methane did more than warm the earth. It triggered a runaway greenhouse effect, a feedback loop that spiraled out of control. As the seas heated, more hydrates melted, releasing even more methane. As the land baked, permafrost and buried soils released gases of their own, amplifying the effect. Each release pushed the world further toward a furnace-like state, and there was no force left to slow it. Imagine walking across Pangaea in this moment. The horizon shimmers with heat, the air heavy and stifling, each breath tasting of ash and sulfur. Rivers that once flowed with fresh water lie reduced to trickles, their banks cracked and dry. The songs of insects and birds are replaced by silence. Even the winds carry no relief, only the suffocating warmth that blankets everything. The oceans, once a refuge, offer no safety. Their surfaces boil with strange blooms. Their depths suffocate in stillness, their chemistry hostile to nearly every form of life. The Great Dying was no longer a series of scattered disasters. It had become a spiral, each event feeding into the next, each new collapse pulling the world further into chaos. With the release of methane, the Earth entered its hottest and most hostile chapter, a fever that wrapped the planet in a grip few creatures could endure. The world had tipped, and from here the storm would only deepen. The release of methane from the seafloor had turned Earth into a furnace. What began as trembling eruptions and poisoned rains now reached its peak in searing heat. Across the globe, temperatures rose by more than 10 degrees Celsius, an increase so staggering that it reshaped the very boundaries of survival. The warming did not creep forward slowly over millennia. It surged, rushing across the planet in waves that left little time for life to adjust. At the equator, where the sunlight already beat down strongest, the change was most devastating. The lands closest to that line of fire became heat traps, places where the air itself turned deadly. Days grew so hot that any creature exposed too long to the open sky risked overheating within hours. Even nights offered no relief. The ground, baked by relentless sunlight, radiated its stored heat back into the air, keeping the atmosphere heavy and suffocating long after it had set. For animals that roamed these regions, survival became a race against exhaustion. Herbivores that had once grazed along green plains found themselves collapsing from heat stress before they could even finish foraging. Carnivores, already weakened by dwindling prey, chased shadows in vain, their bodies unable to keep pace in the sweltering air. Insects that had once filled the skies with their endless buzz fell silent, their fragile bodies unable to cope with the sudden fever that gripped their world. Forests that had resisted the firestorms and the acid rains now faced a different kind of assault. Their leaves curled inward under the burning air, their branches drooped, their roots searched in vain for water that evaporated before it could reach them. Streams that had once wound through fertile valleys shrank into cracked riverbeds, their beds littered with the bones of fish that had perished as pools dried away. The soil itself began to harden, losing what little moisture it still held. With each passing season, the green of Pangaea's coasts gave way to parched emptiness. The oceans reflected this fever as well. Their surface waters absorbed the fierce heat, growing warmer than the creatures within could endure. Fish swam sluggishly in search of cooler depths, but the deeper layers had already lost their oxygen, leaving them trapped between suffocating stillness below and burning temperatures above. Coral reefs that had not yet crumbled under acidification now bleached into pale husks, their colors drained away by stress. Entire food webs strained under the weight of waters too hot to nourish them. Equatorial zones, once rich with life, became zones of death. The combination of scorching heat and stagnant air made large regions uninhabitable. Even creatures that might have migrated to cooler lands found the journey impossible. The distances were too vast, and the changes came too quickly. Species that had adapted over millions of years to specific habitats now had only a handful of generations to cope with conditions entirely outside their range. Most could not keep pace, Imagine walking through one of these regions at the height of the crisis. The air would feel heavy, pressing against your skin, each breath shallow and hot. The horizon would shimmer with rising waves of heat. Trees, once towering, would stand like skeletons, their bark cracked, their branches bare. The land would be eerily silent. No bird calls, no insect hum, no rustle of herds moving through the brush, only the occasional thud of an animal that had collapsed, overcome by the relentless temperature. For creatures that depended on movement, such as hunters and migratory grazers, the heat was a cruel trap. Muscles weakened in the burning air, lungs struggled, and bodies overheated before they could find food or water. Smaller animals retreated to burrows and caves, but even underground the temperature seeped in, raising the air to suffocating levels. The smallest survivors could cling to the edges, but the great majority of species, both large and small, fell one by one. This fever spread far beyond the equator. It touched temperate regions as well, pushing climates into extremes no species had ever faced before. Lands that had once enjoyed cool seasons now baked under new sunlights, their patterns of rain and growth shattered. The global balance tilted sharply, leaving nowhere untouched. The earth itself seemed to groan under the weight of the heat. Clouds of steam rose from drying lakes, carrying more humidity into the atmosphere, which in turn trapped even more warmth. It was a vicious cycle, one that spun faster with each turn. Every creature that gasped in the burning air, every forest that collapsed into dust, every ocean current that faltered added another layer to the spiral. The Great Dying was no longer simply a series of disasters. It had become a fever that gripped the entire planet, a heat beyond survival. And as the temperatures soared, the oxygen in the oceans began to vanish more quickly, pushing life into an even deeper crisis that would soon suffocate the seas themselves. As the world baked beneath rising temperatures, the oceans bore the weight of the fever. Surface waters grew hot, but beneath that shimmering skin, the depths turned still and heavy. For countless ages, currents had churned the seas, mixing the warm upper layers with the cooler depths, delivering oxygen from the surface into the dark places below. With the climate now disrupted, those currents faltered. The oceans lost their breath. It began quietly. In certain shallow basins, oxygen levels dipped just slightly, not enough to be noticed at first. Creatures that lived there swam a little slower, their movements sluggish as if they carried invisible weights. Gills pumped harder, fins beat faster, but the water no longer delivered what their bodies needed. Fish that had darted quickly now lingered in place, their energy fading. But what started small soon spread. The warmer the oceans became, the less oxygen they could hold. It was a cruel irony. The very gas that sustained life dissolved less easily in hot waters. The seas grew warmer, and the oxygen slipped away, vanishing into the air above. With each degree of heat, the invisible lifeline weakened further. Dead zones began to form. At first, they were patches on the seafloor, areas where nothing stirred, where the sediment grew black with decay. Tiny creatures that had lived in the mud suffocated, leaving only emptiness. As the zones expanded, they spread upward into the water itself. Fish that strayed too far into these regions never came back. Shellfish that had clung stubbornly to rocks released their hold and drifted lifelessly to the bottom. Even plankton, the small drifting plants and animals that formed the foundation of ocean life, collapsed in these breathless waters. Imagine swimming through one of these ancient seas. At the surface, the water might still appear alive. Sunlight ripples across the waves, and perhaps a few fish linger in the shallows. But as you dive deeper, The light fades into gloom, and with it the presence of life. The water becomes thick, almost heavy, and the silence presses in. No schools of fish dart around you, no shells scuttle across the sand, no flicker of movement catches your eye. Only blackness, stillness, and the faint outline of bodies resting where they fell. The eerie quiet of these dead zones was unlike anything the earth had known before. The oceans had always been places of sound and movement. Waves and currents carried not only water, but the endless songs of life. Whales had not yet evolved, but fish, ammonites, and countless other creatures had filled the seas with their movements. Now those waters fell silent, the chain of sound broken, as each link in the web of life snapped away. As oxygen disappeared, chemical changes spread. Sulfide, a poisonous gas produced by bacteria that thrive in oxygen-starved environments, began to bubble upward. In places, the seas may have smelled faintly of rotten eggs, a warning of the invisible danger lurking beneath. These toxic gases killed what little life had clung to the edges, spreading the devastation further. The seas themselves became hostile, not only in warmth and acidity, but in their very chemistry. The collapse of oxygen-rich waters was not confined to the deep. Entire stretches of coastline, once home to reefs and thriving fisheries, became deserts of water. Creatures that had lived for millions of years in balance with the tides vanished in mere centuries. Ammonites, those spiral-shelled drifters, could no longer find safe places to thrive. Trilobites, already weakened by earlier crises, disappeared forever in these suffocating seas. For the land above, the loss of marine life brought further hardship. Birds and reptiles that fed along coastlines found little to eat. Rivers carried the smell of decay from the seas inland, a constant reminder that the oceans, which had once offered stability, now delivered only death. The oxygen that had once filled the oceans had been the hidden engine of Earth's diversity. Without it, the seas transformed from the cradle of life into vast graveyards. Currents no longer stirred them, storms no longer revived them, and life no longer filled them with color and sound. What remained was silence, a heavy quiet broken only by the distant rumble of eruptions still churning in Siberia. The oceans had lost their breath, and in that suffocating silence, the great dying tightened its grip further, preparing to pull even more of the planet into its unraveling spiral. As the oceans lost their breath and dead zones spread across their depths, the unraveling of life began at its very foundation. Tiny plankton, almost invisible to the human eye, had always carried an outsized importance. These drifting organisms, some plant-like and others animal-like, formed the first link in the chain that fed everything above them. They filled the seas with their quiet abundance, multiplying in great blooms that sustained fish, ammonites, and even the smallest larvae of creatures that would grow into giants. For millions of years, they had been the invisible architects of survival. Now, under acid seas and suffocating waters, they vanished. Without plankton, the oceans became hollow. The food chains that had once rippled upward from these tiny drifters collapsed almost immediately. Small fish that had depended on them found less and less to eat. Their numbers dwindled within months, their schools thinning until once lively swarms became scattered individuals. Predators that relied on those fish soon followed. Sharks, which had prowled the oceans for ages, grew weaker as their prey disappeared. Ammonites, with their spiral shells and grasping tentacles, starved in open waters that no longer offered sustenance. The collapse rippled upward in brutal efficiency. With each layer stripped away, the next fell with it. Creatures that had once dominated the seas now drifted aimlessly or sank lifeless to the bottom. The energy that had once flowed in countless directions, connecting every creature in complex webs of life, broke apart. The oceans, once vibrant with layers upon layers of interdependence, became still and empty. On land, the story echoed the same theme. Plants had already been weakened by poisoned rain, by firestorms, and by heat that curled their leaves. But now, under relentless pressure, they failed in greater numbers. Fertile forests that had shaded rivers and valleys lost their green canopy. Seed ferns, once abundant, shriveled until their stems broke and fell into lifeless heaps. Even conifers, which had managed to hold on through acid and fire, struggled to grow in soils stripped of nutrients. For herbivores, the collapse of vegetation was devastating. Grazers that had once roamed in great herds now wandered across barren landscapes, searching desperately for food that was no longer there. Their bodies grew thin, ribs showing beneath hides, their movements slowed by hunger. Some collapsed mid-journey, their bones left behind as grim markers of a land that could no longer support them. The predators that hunted these herbivores faced the same fate as those in the seas. At first, they may have found easy meals among the weakened and dying, but soon there were too few left. Each success only brought them closer to starvation. For every prey animal taken was one fewer chance of survival in the days ahead. Great reptilian hunters prowled valleys, where silence replaced the sounds of grazing and movement. Their sharp teeth and powerful bodies became useless tools in a world where abundance had been replaced by emptiness. The collapse was merciless in its speed. Species that had endured for millions of years disappeared in what was, by geological time, the blink of an eye. The web of life did not unravel slowly strand by strand. It tore apart in cascading failures, one link pulling down the next. When plankton fell, fish fell. When fish fell, predators fell. When plants shriveled, herbivores starved. And when herbivores starved, carnivores followed. The silence that spread across the land mirrored the silence of the seas. Valleys once filled with the calls of creatures became empty echoes. Forest floors that had been alive with the buzz of insects and the rustle of foraging animals turned still. On the coasts, seabirds and reptiles found fewer fish and fewer nesting places. Even scavengers, the last to feed on what remained, found less and less until they too faded. Imagine standing in that ancient world as the collapse deepened. You would see vast stretches of emptiness where once there had been life. A coastline that had shimmered with movement would look deserted. A forest that had teemed with noise would feel hollow. The bones of animals would litter the ground, but few living things would cross your path. The great machinery of survival, which had run for ages with remarkable stability, had broken, and as the webs of food collapsed, the rivers that once tied land and sea together carried not life but death. Ash, toxins, and the remnants of decaying bodies washed into waters that were already suffocating. Each stream, each current, spread the damage further, ensuring that the collapse reached every corner of Earth's ecosystems. The planet was no longer a place of abundance. It was becoming a place of absence, a hollowed world where food chains had snapped and survival itself seemed to be slipping away. As the food webs of land and sea unraveled, the rivers that once tied them together began to change in terrifying ways. These waterways had always been lifelines, carrying fresh water through valleys, feeding forests, nourishing plains, and connecting the land to the oceans. But in the age of the Great Dying, they became something else entirely. The rivers turned dark, heavy with ash, choked with debris, and tainted by invisible poisons leached from the land itself. They no longer carried life, they carried death. Every volcanic eruption in Siberia poured ash into the skies, and that ash fell back to earth in thick blankets. It coated hillsides, forests, and plains, waiting for the rains to arrive. When the storms finally came, they washed the ash into streams, filling them with grit that clouded the water until it ran black. What had once been clear and sparkling now looked like sludge. Fish that had managed to survive the earlier waves of acid rain gasped for air in these murky flows, their gills clogged with silt. Insects that laid their eggs in gentle eddies found their breeding grounds smothered. But ash was not the only threat carried by these rivers. Acid rains had seeped into the soil, breaking down rocks and releasing toxic metals that had long been trapped underground. Aluminum, iron, and arsenic leached into the waters, invisible yet deadly. What began as a trickle of poison grew into floods of contamination. Every rainstorm stripped more of these elements from the land, and every stream that flowed carried them further downstream, into lakes, into wetlands, and finally into the seas. For amphibians, this was a death sentence. These creatures had been some of the great survivors of earlier ages, thriving in both water and on land, their moist skins allowing them to breathe through more than just their lungs. But that same gift now betrayed them. Their permeable skin absorbed the toxins with each breath, each step into a puddle, each swim through a stream. Eggs laid in shallow pools dissolved in the chemical brew before the young inside could even develop. Tadpoles writhed and perished as the poisons burned their gills and soft bodies. Adults staggered to shore in search of safety, only to collapse in fields that offered no shelter. For millions of years, amphibians had been dominant along riverbanks and lakes, thriving as both predators and prey in these fertile systems. Now their voices fell silent. The croaks and calls that had filled ancient nights vanished, leaving the waters eerily quiet. Their disappearance marked not only the loss of species, but the loss of entire roles in the ecosystem. Without amphibians, insects bred unchecked, and without insects, the creatures that fed on them faltered as well. The collapse spread outward in ever-widening ripples. Freshwater systems across Pangaea faltered under the strain. Lakes that had once teemed with fish turned sour and stagnant. Rivers that had wound like silver threads across the continent became black scars of ash and poison. Wetlands, those rich halfway worlds between land and water, dried into cracked mudflats or festered into toxic swamps. Every niche that had once offered abundance became hostile. Imagine walking along one of these rivers in that time. The air would carry a sharp metallic tang, the smell of poison rising with the mist. The water, once cool and clear, would run hot with runoff, its surface streaked with oil-like films. Fish would float belly up in clusters, their bodies pale and lifeless. Amphibians, once so numerous, would lie twisted on the banks, their skins blistered, their legs stiff in unnatural angles. Even birds and reptiles that came to drink would falter, their throats burning as they swallowed the tainted flow. The failure of freshwater systems was especially cruel, for rivers had always been the connectors of life. They carried not just water but nutrients, linking ecosystems across vast distances. When those systems collapsed, the damage spread further than any single forest or plain. Poison flowed from mountains to valleys, from valleys to coasts, and from coasts into the seas already reeling from heat and suffocation. The rivers became highways of death, delivering the decay of the land into every corner of the Earth's hydrological cycle. Each rainfall, each flood, each swollen current carried more toxins, ensuring that no refuge remained untouched. What had once been the heartbeat of the land now pulsed with poison, draining the strength of every living thing that touched it. And while the rivers bled their toxins outward, the fossil record was beginning to capture their toll. Sediments from that time show layers thick with metals and ash, layers where amphibian remains vanish almost entirely. These are the silent pages of history that record the moment when freshwater life, once dominant and diverse, was nearly erased. The earth was unraveling on every front, and as the rivers spread their poison further and further, the great graveyards of extinction began to take shape across land and sea alike. As the poisoned rivers bled across the land and the oceans suffocated under heat and chemistry gone wrong, the living world fell into silence. That silence was not temporary. It was the silence of absence, of creatures that had filled the earth for millions of years, vanishing all at once. Today we see their loss written in stone, in layers of fossilized earth that hold the traces of their final moments. Those layers are the graveyards of the Permian, and they tell us a story too vast, too sudden, and too haunting to ignore. In the rocks of South China, in South Africa, in Russia, and in far-off corners of what was once Pangaea, scientists uncover seams of blackened sediment where life seems to stop abruptly. Above those layers, fossils are abundant. Below them, seas and lands are filled with the remains of thriving ecosystems. But in the thin bands that mark the time of the Great Dying, those fossils vanish. It is as if the pages of life's storybook were ripped out, leaving only silence. The fossils that do remain tell of sudden, catastrophic endings. In some places, entire beds of shellfish are found lying side by side, thousands of individuals locked in the same layer, their shells sealed shut as if they had all died in the same moment. Ammonites, those coiled drifters of the seas, appear plentiful in one layer, and then above that line they are gone forever. Trilobites, which had survived multiple extinctions before, finally disappeared completely, leaving no descendants to carry their form forward. On land, the graveyards are just as stark. In the Karoo Basin of South Africa, paleontologists have uncovered vast stretches of sediment where skeletons of reptilian creatures lie jumbled together, their bones twisted as if they had collapsed where they stood. Many show no signs of predation, no evidence of violence. They simply stopped living, victims of a world that no longer offered food, water, or air that could sustain them. Creatures that had been dominant for millions of years, such as the gorgonopsids with their saber-like teeth, vanished almost overnight. The haunting stillness of abandoned ecosystems is preserved in these fossil beds. Forests that had once supported insects, reptiles, and mammal-like creatures leave behind only stumps and charcoal remnants, a record of fire followed by emptiness. Wetlands that had teemed with amphibians yield only the faintest traces of creatures that had once croaked and crawled in abundance. Entire landscapes that had been full of noise and movement became still, and that stillness was captured in the mud, in the ash, and in the stone that hardened over millions of years. The fossil record also captures the absence of recovery. In many layers following the extinction horizon, there is little to be found for long stretches of time. Geologists call these horizons dead zones, because the rocks show almost no signs of life at all. In the oceans, for several million years after the Great Dying, reefs do not return. For a world used to quick rebounds, this long emptiness is extraordinary. The silence lasted not just moments but ages, stretching far beyond a single catastrophe, echoing through time. Imagine standing in such a world. A valley that once rang with the calls of animals now lies deserted, with only the wind moving through skeletal trees. A shoreline that once shimmered with shells and fish lies barren, the sand littered with empty husks. The air itself feels still, heavy with the absence of wings, of movement, of sound. The Earth became a graveyard so immense that it stretched across every continent, every sea, every horizon. For scientists today, piecing together these records is like opening a tomb. The fossils whisper of creatures that lived, thrived, and then fell silent in synchrony. They remind us that extinction is not only about death, it is about disappearance, about voices that never return, about entire ways of life that are erased from the planet's memory. The Great Dying did not only kill individuals, it removed entire species, entire families, entire branches of the evolutionary tree. The stone layers that preserve this silence are not just cold records, they are markers of a moment when Earth itself nearly lost the thread of life. They show us the suddenness of the collapse, the completeness of the loss, and the stillness that followed. A silence so total that even millions of years later, it lingers in the fossils we uncover today. And as the silence spread across land and sea, the few creatures that still clung to survival faced a world reshaped into emptiness, where only the most adaptable could continue their struggle. In the wake of the silence, when forests stood as blackened stumps and oceans turned heavy and lifeless, the earth was far from empty. Life, though battered to its very core, did not vanish completely. It clung on in the smallest corners, in the darkest cracks, in the places overlooked and often dismissed. These last strugglers were not the giants that had once dominated the Permian world, not the saber-toothed hunters or the sprawling herds of plant-eaters, but the small and the hidden, the opportunists whose greatest strength was not power or size, but adaptability. Beneath the surface of the land, burrowing animals retreated into the soil. Their tunnels became havens against the poisoned air and the searing heat above. In these narrow underground shelters, the temperature was cooler, the air slightly less toxic, the environment shielded from the worst of the firestorms and acid rains. Small reptile-like creatures, known as dicynodonts, distant relatives of mammals, dug into the earth to wait out the chaos. Their bodies, more compact and resilient than the lumbering hunters that had ruled above, gave them an advantage in a world where survival meant hiding. Insects, too, found refuge underground, or beneath the bark of trees that had not yet collapsed. Beetles laid their eggs in sheltered cavities, their larvae chewing through what plant matter still remained, feeding on decay when living vegetation was gone. Termites and other soil-dwelling species kept working in silence, recycling what little organic matter was left, turning death itself into sustenance. These small, hidden creatures became the engines of survival, thriving where larger animals starved. On the surface, many of the great predators and herbivores perished, but smaller species proved more flexible. They were able to switch diets, to eat what was available, rather than depend on one kind of food. Scavengers fed on carcasses left behind by the giants. Omnivores adapted to whatever scraps the barren land provided. In a world stripped of abundance, versatility was often the only path forward. The seas too harbored their last strugglers. While the grand reefs had disintegrated and the once mighty ammonites dwindled, some small bivalves and crustaceans found ways to endure. They tolerated low oxygen levels better than others, or survived by burrowing into the mud, where tiny pockets of livable conditions still lingered. Certain microbial communities even thrived, feeding on chemicals released into the water. To human eyes, these survivors might seem insignificant, yet in their persistence, they carried the thread of life through one of Earth's darkest hours. Adaptability became the greatest shield. Those that could adjust quickly to shifting climates, to poisoned water, to scarce food, had a chance. Those that required stability, that depended on delicate ecosystems or vast resources, were lost. The giants that had once seemed invincible crumbled, while the overlooked endured. It was not strength or speed that decided survival, but flexibility, the ability to dig, to hide, to scavenge, to change. Imagine the world as it appeared then. On the surface, silence reigned. Great hunters, like the gorgonopsids, lay extinct, their sharp teeth and powerful bodies useless in a barren land. The massive herds of reptilian grazers were gone, their bones left in empty valleys. Forests no longer rang with insect calls. And yet, if you bent close to the ground, pressed your ear to the soil, you might hear the faint scratching of claws in the earth, the soft rustle of creatures burrowing and moving in the hidden dark. Life, fragile and quiet, still pulsed beneath the surface. These last strugglers would not have appeared impressive to the eye. They were not rulers of their time, not dominant or commanding. They were survivors, holding on by instinct and luck, waiting for the storm to pass. Yet in their persistence lay the seeds of the future. The adaptability that allowed them to endure would one day shape the next chapters of evolution. The world that had belonged to the giants now rested in the hands of the small. The earth had not gone silent completely. Beneath the graveyards and the poisoned rivers, beneath the collapsing forests and the suffocating seas, tiny lives carried on, stubbornly refusing to vanish. Their presence was faint, but it was enough to keep the flame of existence alive. And as these survivors scratched and crawled through the ruined world, the oceans continued to shift in ways that would bring even deeper mysteries. For the seas, already stripped of their breath, were on the verge of a collapse even more profound than what had unfolded on land. While life on land clung on in the shadows and soil, the oceans carried the heaviest burden of the great dying. More than 9 out of every 10 species in the seas disappeared, a loss so severe that it left scars still visible in the fossil record today. The mystery of why the ocean suffered even more than the land lies in the unique ways water both supports and betrays life. At first glance, the seas should have offered more stability than the land. They stretched across most of the planet, vast reservoirs that could absorb heat, spread nutrients, and shelter countless forms of life in their depths. But that same vastness became a trap when the Earth's systems shifted. The volcanic eruptions and the release of methane had already heated the atmosphere, and that heat sank into the waters, warming them far beyond their natural ranges. Warm water holds less oxygen, and as the seas grew hotter, their ability to sustain life shrank. But oxygen was not the only thing disappearing. The collapse of circulation patterns meant that the oceans stopped mixing properly. Normally, surface currents deliver oxygen down into the depths, while deeper currents bring nutrients back up. This constant stirring is the heartbeat of the seas, keeping life flowing in both directions. But with the climate in chaos, this heartbeat slowed and then faltered. The deeper waters turned stagnant, sealed off from oxygen, while the surface grew thinner and thinner in life. Beneath the waves, silence spread faster than on land, and with that silence came something worse. In the absence of oxygen, other forms of chemistry took hold. Strange bacteria that could survive without oxygen began to dominate. They fed on sulfur compounds buried in the sediments of the sea floor, releasing hydrogen sulfide into the water. This gas, toxic to most forms of life, spread through the stagnant layers. The seas became sulfitic, saturated with poison. Fish that strayed too far into these waters suffocated not only from the lack of oxygen, but also from the direct toxicity of the gas. Shellfish collapsed in droves. Even hardy crustaceans that had endured countless cycles of change perished. Imagine swimming through those ancient seas. At the surface, the light still dances on the water, but beneath, the depths glow with an eerie greenish tint. the sign of sulfur-loving bacteria blooming in the absence of oxygen. Below that, the water is heavy and silent, filled with poison. Nothing stirs, no fins flicker, no shells scuttle along the bottom. The seafloor lies littered with the remains of those that strayed into the wrong depths. Entire classes of marine life were erased in this chemical apocalypse. Coral reefs, once sprawling and filled with color, had already been weakened by acidification. Now, as toxic waters spread, they vanished completely, leaving no structures behind to host the countless species that depended on them. Trilobites, survivors of earlier crises, were wiped out forever. Ammonites dwindled to a handful of survivors. Even plankton, the very foundation of marine ecosystems, collapsed in the poisoned waters. And yet, as always, life did not vanish completely. A few strange survivors clung to the edges of these hostile seas. Certain small bivalves adapted to the low oxygen waters, burrowing into sediments where they could find tiny pockets of safety. Some microbes thrived, not only tolerating the sulfur, but using it as fuel, creating bizarre ecosystems that seemed alien compared to the thriving seas that had existed only a short time before. These survivors were not dominant or diverse, but they endured in niches where most life had failed. The oceans of the Permian became places of extremes, surface waters scorched by heat and starved of oxygen, mid-level waters stained with sulfur, and the depths turned into silent graveyards. For millions of years, recovery was slow and uncertain. The seas, once the richest home of life on Earth, had become the greatest tomb of the great dying. On the land above, the consequences of this collapse spread quickly. With the oceans emptying of life, coastlines that had once been rich, feeding grounds turned barren. Reptiles, amphibians, and even insects that depended on the bounty of the waters faced hunger. The Earth's interconnected web of life tightened further, and the losses in the seas pulled the land deeper into crisis. And while the oceans poisoned themselves from within, the skies above continued their violent swings, pushing the world into a climate so unstable that even the survivors would face new and unpredictable trials. The seas had turned against life, poisoned with sulfur and stripped of oxygen, yet above the waters the air itself carried its own cruelty. The eruptions in Siberia never truly stopped. They pulsed for hundreds of thousands of years, each wave releasing not just lava, but staggering amounts of gas and ash into the atmosphere. These bursts did not strike evenly. They came in fits and surges, forcing the planet into wild swings between cold and heat, shadow and fire. It was a climate whiplash, a chaos that kept life staggering until it could no longer stand. After some of the greatest eruptions, vast plumes of ash and aerosols spread across the globe. They veiled the sunlight in curtains of darkness, scattering its rays before they could warm the earth. Temperatures plummeted. Seasons that should have brought growth delivered frost and withering cold instead. Plants, already weakened by poisoned soils and failing rains, froze where they stood. Insects that clung to fragile leaves fell in masses when the cold struck too suddenly. Animals searching for food found only brittle vegetation and empty landscapes, the chill stealing their strength as they starved. But just as creatures began to adapt to the bitter conditions, the pendulum swung violently the other way. The same eruptions that darkened the skies also released carbon dioxide in staggering quantities. Once the ash settled and the skies cleared, the greenhouse gases remained, trapping heat with relentless efficiency. The earth rebounded not into normal warmth, but into blazing summers that dwarfed anything life had known before. The ground cracked under searing heat, rivers shrank further, and forests that had barely survived the cold now collapsed in the furnace. The cycle repeated itself again and again. Winters born of ash and sulfur rains gave way to summers lit by a sunlight magnified through veils of greenhouse gas. Each swing carved deeper into ecosystems already stretched thin. Creatures that had somehow endured freezing nights now faced burning days. Eggs that might have hatched in cooler pools were boiled away in shallow waters. Migratory animals that had once followed stable seasons found themselves betrayed, their patterns leading them into death instead of sustenance. For predators, the chaos was unbearable. In cold years, prey weakened, but there was little to hunt because starvation carried them away first. In hot years, water sources dried up, forcing desperate animals to congregate around shrinking lakes and rivers where disease and exhaustion spread quickly. The unpredictability of the climate meant no species could plan, no strategy could ensure survival. Adaptability had carried some creatures this far, but whiplash struck faster than life could adjust. The fossil record shows this instability written in stone. Layers of sediment from the time of the Great Dying reveal alternating signs of cold and heat. One layer shows black shale, deposited when oxygen vanished from stagnant seas, a signal of warming. Above it lies evidence of sudden cooling, marked by ash and shifts in isotope signatures. The swings were so sharp that they left the Earth itself scarred with alternating records of fire and ice. For the creatures living through it, these shifts were not just lines in rock, but daily struggles that cut into every breath and every bite of food. Imagine standing on Pangaea during one of these swings. One year the winds bite with cold, the ground frozen under ash-darkened skies, animals huddled and shivering. The very next, the same place lies under a blistering sunlight, the air thick with heat, the soil cracked open, the horizon shimmering with mirages. No cycle is reliable, no season is familiar, no refuge remains stable. It is not simply the presence of cold or heat that crushes life, but the unpredictability of their arrival, the impossibility of adapting to a world that changes too violently and too often. Extinction thrived in this chaos. It was not only the direct blows of firestorms, acid rains, or poisoned oceans that carried life toward collapse, but the relentless instability of a climate spinning out of control. Every new eruption brought a different disaster, and each disaster struck before ecosystems could recover from the last. The world no longer had rhythms, it had spasms, and as these spasms grew longer and more violent, the planet itself began to record the devastation in layers of stone, preserving the traces of a biosphere unraveling under forces it could not endure. Those scars, etched deep into Earth's crust, still whisper the story of a time when the climate's wild swings became as deadly as the disasters that first unleashed them. The chaos of the Great Dying did not simply vanish with the creatures it consumed. Every collapse, every poisoned river, every ocean starved of breath left its imprint behind. The earth itself became a witness, and its rocks recorded the devastation with a quiet patience that no living eye could have matched. Long after the forests burned to charcoal and the seas turned green with sulfur, the traces remained, written in stone for those who would one day seek to read them. Across the world, geologists uncover layers of black shale, thick bands of rock that speak of oceans suffocated. Shale is born from mud, and in ordinary times it carries the signature of rich marine life, full of fossils, shells, and fragments of plants and animals. But these black layers are different. They are heavy, dark, and lifeless. They formed in waters where oxygen had collapsed so completely that nothing larger could live. As organic matter sank to the bottom, there was no oxygen to decay it, so it gathered and pressed into thick beds, leaving a record of seas that had become silent tombs. To hold one of these black slabs today is to hold a page torn from a chapter when oceans themselves forgot how to breathe. Within these layers, scientists also read chemical signatures, ghostly patterns left in the atoms themselves. Carbon isotopes, the subtle variations in carbon that flow through the cycles of life, reveal a planet in crisis. Normally, the ratios of carbon-12 to carbon-13 shift gently as plants absorb carbon dioxide and pass it through the web of life. But during the Great Dying, those ratios swung wildly. Massive releases of carbon from volcanoes, followed by methane escaping from the seafloor, flooded the atmosphere and oceans. These surges left behind sharp, unmistakable marks in the carbon record, spikes and plunges that speak of catastrophic warming. Each jagged turn is like the signature of a fever written into stone, showing how the Earth's balance was tipped violently again and again. Beyond the chemistry, the very landscapes of the planet still carry the scars. In Siberia, the immense basalt fields of the Siberian Traps stretch across hundreds of thousands of square miles. Layer upon layer of dark rock lies stacked like pages, each one a record of an eruption that bled fire across the land. These rocks are not ordinary flows. Some extend for hundreds of miles. Some are thicker than city skyscrapers. Together, they hold the frozen memory of a world drowning in lava, its surface reshaped into hardened waves of basalt that still stand today as monuments to the fury that began it all. Other scars appear in places far from Siberia. Sedimentary rocks from South Africa, Greenland, and China reveal sudden breaks in fossil abundance. In one layer, the remains of thriving ecosystems lie thick and plentiful. In the layer above, they are gone, replaced with barren mudstone or shale. These abrupt transitions are the fossilized echoes of extinction, moments where entire ecosystems collapsed so quickly that the rock itself looks startled. In some areas, unusual minerals testify to the acid rains that stripped soils bare. Layers rich in aluminum and other metals suggest that acids leached them from the land and carried them into rivers. In others, microscopic crystals reveal sudden cooling episodes when volcanic aerosols dimmed the sunlight. Each scar tells not just of one disaster but of many, stacked and woven together into a tapestry of collapse. To walk across these rocks today is to step over a frozen memory of silence. The black shales whisper of seas that drowned in stillness. The isotope spikes reveal the breathless surges of carbon that burn the planet with fever. The basalt plateaus rise as silent witnesses to firestorms that raged for hundreds of thousands of years. Each scar is a sentence, each layer a page, and together they form the geological storybook of Earth's near death. And within that story, one lesson is clear. The Earth remembers, even when ecosystems vanish, even when entire lineages are erased, the rocks hold the truth. They are the patient archivists of deep time, carrying forward the evidence of catastrophe long after life itself has forgotten. The scars of the Great Dying did not heal quickly. They stretched across continents, across oceans, across millions of years of recovery, and within those scars lie the unmistakable proof of extinction, so sudden and so thorough that even the passage of deep time could not erase it. Yet beyond those black shales and carbon marks, there is another kind of record, one etched not in chemistry or stone, but in the fossils of creatures that once thrived and then vanished, leaving behind snapshots of a world reset. The scars of the Great Dying are not only etched into the rocks and chemistry of the earth, they are also written in the bones, shells, and imprints of the creatures that lived and then vanished. Fossils, scattered across continents, provide before and after snapshots of a planet that changed almost overnight. They tell us not only what was lost, but also how sudden and complete the losses were. When we look at the fossil record of this time, it is as if the pages of life were torn in half, one side crowded with diversity, the other side nearly blank. In layers of stone laid down before the extinction, the world looks rich and busy. Trilobites, ammonites, brachiopods, corals, and fish fill the seas, while mammal-like reptiles, amphibians, and forests cover the land. Fossils appear in dense abundance, overlapping each other, sometimes so plentiful that entire beds are formed from nothing but shells and bones pressed together. These are the echoes of ecosystems that had thrived for millions of years, each species occupying its niche, each part of the chain strong and resilient. Then comes the line. It is often thin, sometimes just a few centimeters of rock, but it marks a moment when everything shifted. Above that line, abundance vanishes. Where once there had been countless species, there are suddenly only a few. Beds that were packed with fossils become barren. The transition is stark, like a candle being snuffed out. The difference is not gradual, it is immediate, visible in stone, a record of collapse so complete that even millions of years later, it cannot be mistaken for anything else. Among the most haunting disappearances are the trilobites. These armored, many-legged creatures had walked the seafloors and swum through the oceans for over 270 million years. They had survived earlier extinctions, adapting again and again to changing seas, diversifying into thousands of species that filled nearly every marine environment. For much of Earth's history, they were a symbol of resilience, yet in the layers that mark the Great Dying, they vanish entirely. Above that horizon in the rock, no trilobite ever appears again. After hundreds of millions of years, their long story ended in silence. Other groups shared a similar fate. Rugose corals, which had built massive reefs that stretched across shallow seas, disappeared forever. Some groups of brachiopods, which had flourished since the Cambrian, collapsed and never recovered. The graceful sea scorpions, once formidable hunters of ancient waters, also failed to cross the threshold. The extinction erased entire lineages, wiping clean evolutionary experiments that had endured for ages. What had been a crowded tapestry of life became threadbare in a single geological instant. On land, the fossil record shows the same sharp divide. Before the extinction, mammal-like reptiles, known as therapsids, dominated the landscape. They came in many shapes and sizes, from powerful predators to stocky grazers. Their fossils are abundant in Permian rocks, showing them spread across Pangaea in every kind of environment. But in layers laid down after the extinction, their diversity shrinks to just a handful of forms. The once mighty gorgonopsids, with their long saber teeth, vanish completely. Only smaller, hardier relatives linger, clinging to survival in a world reset. The fossil record captures not only absence, but also stillness. In many regions, the rocks laid down just after the extinction contain very few fossils at all. For long stretches of time, they are nearly empty, as if the earth itself paused between chapters, holding its breath before life could resume. Geologists call these intervals dead zones. To study them is to gaze into silence, to sift through rocks that should have been full of shells and bones, yet yield almost nothing. They are the most direct evidence of how complete the collapse was, how nearly life had been erased. This suddenness is what makes the fossils so haunting. Evolution usually works slowly, species emerging and fading across millions of years. But here the contrast is instant. One layer filled with diversity, the next barren. It is not the steady drift of time, but a cliff, a fall into emptiness. The fossils are proof that the Great Dying was not a slow decline, but a catastrophe that struck so sharply it carved a wound visible across the entire world. In this way, the Earth's fossil record becomes more than a collection of ancient bones and shells. It is a record of erasure. The trilobite's long history ends in a thin line of stone. The coral's reefs disappear into rubble. The forests of seed ferns and towering trees are reduced to scattered charcoal. Each fossil gap is a story untold, a lineage cut short, a reminder of how fragile even the most enduring creatures can be when the planet itself turns hostile. And while the fossils preserve the silence of what was lost, they also highlight the strange survivors that slipped through the cracks, those few lineages that endured in the reset world, waiting to rise in the emptiness left behind. When we look back at the fossil record, at the thin lines where whole species vanish, at the black shales that speak of silent oceans, we can trace much of the destruction to one source. It was not a single impact from the sky, not a passing catastrophe that came and went in an instant, but something far slower, yet vastly more relentless. The power of the Siberian Traps stands at the heart of the Great Dying, a force so immense that even today, in our age of towering cities and global industry, humanity has never witnessed anything remotely close. The eruptions began in what is now Siberia, but at that time it was part of the giant supercontinent of Pangaea. They did not start with one mountain exploding, as we might imagine when we picture a volcano. Instead, the Earth itself split open in massive fissures that stretched for miles. From these cracks, lava poured out in colossal floods, not for days or weeks, but in pulses that lasted hundreds of thousands of years. The scale of these outpourings is almost beyond comprehension. Over the course of this volcanic age, more than 3 million cubic kilometers of lava spread across the land. To put that in perspective, it is enough molten rock to bury the entire United States under a layer several kilometers thick. Entire mountain ranges could fit inside that volume many times over. The Siberian Traps cover an area so vast that even today, after millions of years of erosion, the hardened lava fields stretch over much of Siberia, a region larger than most countries. Imagine standing on that ancient land as the eruptions raged. Instead of one towering cone belching smoke, the horizon would glow red with multiple fissures, each one spewing rivers of molten rock. Lava would flow for hundreds of miles, swallowing valleys, forests, and rivers in sheets of fire. Explosions would send fountains of glowing stone into the sky, while plumes of ash rose like black mountains, spreading across continents. The heat was so intense that forests ignited far from the actual lava flows, fire feeding on fire until the land itself seemed to burn endlessly. These eruptions were not a single event, but a drawn-out fury. Waves of activity pulsed over hundreds of thousands of years, with quiet periods followed by new outbursts. Life might have begun to recover in one place, only to be crushed again as another surge of lava poured out. Each pulse added more carbon dioxide, more sulfur, more chlorine to the atmosphere, layering catastrophe upon catastrophe. The Earth never had time to heal before the next blow arrived. The gases released were as destructive as the lava itself. Carbon dioxide drove the greenhouse effect, superheating the planet. Sulfur created acid rains that stripped soils bare. Chlorine ate away at the ozone layer, allowing harsher radiation to reach the surface. With every eruption, the balance of air, water, and land tipped further out of control. The Siberian Traps were not just rivers of fire, they were fountains of poison, altering the chemistry of the entire Earth. If humanity were to witness such an event today, it would be beyond anything we could endure. The largest eruptions in recorded history, such as Krakatoa or Mount Tambora, released only a tiny fraction of the material unleashed by the Siberian Traps. Even the eruption that darkened skies in 1815 and caused a year without summer was insignificant compared to the torrents of lava that flowed in the late Permian. The difference is not one of scale alone, but of magnitude so vast it reshaped every ecosystem on the planet. The hardened lava field still exists today, black stair-step plateaus stretching across Siberia. They are called traps from the Swedish word for stairs, because the layers of basalt cooled into stacked formations that look like steps leading into the horizon. To walk across them now is to walk over the frozen remains of a catastrophe, each layer a page in the story of fire that nearly ended life. These rocks remind us that the earth itself has the power to change its face, to alter its balance in ways that make survival a matter of luck and adaptability. The Siberian Traps were not simply eruptions. They were the engine of a mass extinction, the unrelenting heartbeat of fire that drove the world toward silence. And as those eruptions burned and bled gases into the air, questions remain about whether another force, perhaps falling from the skies, added to the destruction, complicating the story of how life was almost erased. The fury of the Siberian Traps seems powerful enough to explain the Great Dying on its own. Millions of cubic kilometers of lava, hundreds of thousands of years of fire, and gases that poisoned the skies and seas created a chain of disasters that brought life to the edge of erasure. Yet some scientists have asked whether there might have been another blow, one not from within the Earth, but from beyond it. Could an asteroid impact, like the one that ended the age of the dinosaurs, have also played a role in the worst extinction in history? The idea arises partly from the abruptness of the fossil record. In many places, entire lineages vanish within the space of a single rock layer, as if cut down in an instant. That sharpness feels familiar. 66 million years ago, a 10-kilometer wide asteroid struck what is now the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico. The Chicxulub impact left behind a crater more than 150 kilometers across, as well as a global layer of iridium-rich dust, a fingerprint of material from space. The strike set off tsunamis, wildfires, and a sudden global winter that doomed the dinosaurs. Faced with the similar sharp losses of the Great Dying, it is natural to wonder whether the same kind of cosmic visitor played a part. Some researchers have pointed to possible craters that may date to the end of the Permian. In Australia, structures buried beneath layers of younger rock hint at circular formations, scarred shapes that could be remnants of ancient impacts. In Antarctica, another candidate has been suggested, though its features are faint and hard to distinguish from the shifting of ice and continental plates over millions of years. These clues are tantalizing, but they are uncertain. The scars of Earth's surface do not last forever. Time buries them, erodes them, and reshapes them until their outlines blur. Unlike the Chicxulub crater, which is young and well preserved, any impact structure from more than 250 million years ago would be worn down almost beyond recognition. Other pieces of evidence have been debated. Some rocks from the extinction horizon contain tiny mineral grains called shocked quartz, which are often formed under the intense pressures of an impact. Others show small spherical droplets known as spherules, which can form when rock is vaporized by a strike and then falls back to Earth as molten rain. These features resemble the signs of an impact, yet they are not conclusive. Shocked quartz can also form during immense volcanic eruptions, and spherules may come from powerful blasts of lava and gas. The line between a cosmic impact and a volcanic catastrophe can blur in the chemical and physical signatures they leave behind. The asteroid hypothesis remains intriguing, but it struggles against one overwhelming truth. The Siberian Traps erupted for hundreds of thousands of years, on a scale that dwarfs any known impact. Even if an asteroid did strike during the Great Dying, it would have been only one thread in a tapestry of destruction already woven by fire from the Earth's mantle. The release of carbon dioxide and methane from the traps alone explains the runaway greenhouse effect. The acid rains, the oxygen-starved oceans, and the cascading extinctions. The consistency of geological evidence across the globe points again and again to volcanism as the driving force. Still, the asteroid question lingers in the imagination. Impacts are dramatic, sudden, and easy to picture. A fiery object tearing through the skies, a thunderous explosion, a shockwave racing around the globe. Volcanism, by contrast, is relentless rather than immediate, a disaster measured in centuries instead of seconds. Yet, in their effects, the Siberian Traps were every bit as devastating as a strike from the heavens, perhaps even more so. Instead of a single impact winter, Earth endured cycles of volcanic winters and greenhouse summers for hundreds of thousands of years. The violence of the cosmos may capture our attention, but in this case, it seems the greatest danger came from within the planet itself. Even if no asteroid fell to finish the job, the debate reminds us of how fragile the balance of life can be. Whether from space or from the mantle beneath our feet, the forces that shaped the Great Dying were immense, layered, and intertwined. What we know with certainty is that the extinction was no simple event. It was a storm of many disasters, each compounding the next, leaving behind a world forever changed. And while scientists continue to debate the possibility of an impact, the story that rises most clearly from the rocks is one of cascading collapse, where weakened ecosystems faced not just one enemy, but many hidden killers waiting to exploit the chaos. The power of the Siberian Traps and the possible question of an asteroid strike give us images of violent, dramatic destruction, but not every threat of the Great Dying arrived in fire and thunder. Some dangers crept in quietly, invisible to the eye, spreading not through eruptions or poisoned skies, but through the fragile bodies of the survivors themselves. When ecosystems collapse, when creatures are starved, overheated, and weakened, another enemy finds its chance. Disease may have become one of the hidden killers that deepened Earth's darkest extinction. In a stable world, species often live with pathogens in a kind of uneasy balance, a population that is healthy, well-fed, and spread across wide habitats can resist or recover from outbreaks. But when the land is stripped of plants, when rivers are poisoned, when oxygen dwindles in the seas, that balance is lost. Weakened animals crowd into the same shrinking refuges, searching for food and water. Their bodies, already stressed by hunger and heat, lose the strength to fight infection. Diseases that might once have been minor become lethal. Imagine herds of herbivores forced into ever smaller patches of green. Their ribs show through their skin, their muscles wasted by starvation. Into this desperate gathering, a bacterial infection spreads through wounds and sores, carried on the air, in the water, or by scavenging insects. Normally, a few might fall sick while the rest continue on, but now entire groups collapse at once, their immune systems too weak to resist. For predators, these sickened prey may seem like easy meals, but with each bite, they too carry the infection forward, passing it on until hunters and hunted alike are caught in the same invisible web. In the oceans, similar pressures would have existed. Fish, ammonites, and other marine creatures were already struggling with acidic waters and low oxygen. The stress of living in such hostile conditions may have left them vulnerable to parasites and infections that spread through crowded, suffocating seas. The fossil record hints at this possibility. Some bones from the end of the Permian show strange lesions, pitting, and deformities that suggest illness. These marks are faint whispers, but they point toward a world where disease may have spread widely, leaving scars even on the remains that survive today. The collapse of ecosystems also created opportunities for pathogens to spread across species. Normally, boundaries in the natural world keep diseases contained. An amphibian parasite might never reach a reptile. A bacterial infection in fish might never cross into shellfish, but during the Great Dying, those boundaries blurred. With ecosystems fractured, with food chains collapsing, survivors were forced into unusual habitats and diets. Amphibians ventured into new waters. Reptiles fed on carcasses they would not normally touch. Scavengers dug into decaying bodies that carried unfamiliar parasites. Each encounter was a chance for a pathogen to leap into a new host, amplifying its spread. The very conditions of the time would have favored these hidden killers. Heat speeds up the growth of microbes. Stagnant waters, stripped of oxygen, can harbor bacteria that thrive in anaerobic environments. Wounds from burns, falls, or starvation made animals more vulnerable to infection. Disease did not need to strike as a single pandemic sweeping the planet. It only needed to exploit the weakness left behind by fire, poison, and heat, pushing already stressed populations over the edge. For the small number of survivors, resistance may have been a matter of chance as much as adaptation. Some may have carried natural immunity to pathogens that decimated others. Others may have lived in isolated refuges where infections could not reach. In such a fragile world, luck and circumstance became as important as strength or speed. The fossil record does not preserve viruses or bacteria themselves, but it does preserve their echoes. The lesions in bone, the deformations in shells, the signs of stress in growth patterns all suggest that disease walked beside the other killers of the Great Dying. It was not the dramatic force that reshaped continents or poisoned the oceans, but it may have been the quieter whisper that finished what fire and suffocation began. In this way, the Great Dying was not one catastrophe, but many, layered upon each other, each making life weaker and more fragile until even the smallest threats became fatal. Volcanic fire may have lit the fuse, and chemical poisons may have spread the destruction, but in the shadows, infections and diseases may have played their own deadly part, turning a wounded world into a dying one. And as the hidden killers exploited the weakness of life, another force was also at work, one far larger than any single pathogen. The collapse of ecosystems had become unstoppable, a chain reaction in which each loss pulled down countless others, like dominoes falling through the natural order of the earth. When ecosystems are whole, they are resilient. Every creature, every plant, every insect, every microbe holds a thread, and together those threads weave a web that is strong enough to withstand change. But once too many strands are cut, the web begins to unravel in ways that cannot be reversed. During the Great Dying, the collapse of ecosystems became more than a series of individual deaths. It became a chain reaction, each loss pulling down another, until the fall of one species meant the fall of many more. At the base of this collapse were the smallest players, plankton in the oceans, seed ferns on land, and countless insects formed the foundation of life. When plankton declined, fish that depended on them weakened. When fish fell, the predators that hunted them faced starvation. Insects that once pollinated plants and recycled waste dwindled, leaving vegetation struggling to reproduce and soils struggling to renew. Each loss rippled outward, striking connections that had built up over millions of years. Imagine the fall of a single species of shellfish in the seas. Its disappearance would leave fewer meals for small fish. Those fish, unable to find enough to eat, would produce fewer offspring. Larger predators that depended on those fish would then struggle, their populations shrinking. Scavengers that fed on leftovers would find little to consume. The absence of one humble species cascaded upward, multiplying its impact far beyond its size. The Great Dying was filled with these small collapses, each one amplifying the next. On land, the same fragile interdependence unraveled. When forests shrank and plants withered under acid rains, heat, and poisoned soils, herbivores faced hunger. Their populations plummeted as grazing grounds disappeared. Carnivores that had once thrived on abundant herds now prowled empty valleys, their sharp teeth and powerful jaws useless without prey. The collapse of vegetation did not only remove food, it also stripped away shelter. Eggs that had once been hidden under leaves lay exposed. Small animals that had darted through roots and branches lost their cover. Predators found no meals, but prey found no refuge either. The balance tipped in every direction. Even microbes and decomposers played their part in the domino effect. With fewer plants to rot and fewer animals to recycle, the cycles of nutrients slowed. Soils turned barren, unable to hold water or nourish what little vegetation remained. Streams that once carried rich organic matter now carried only ash and metal. The Earth's ability to repair itself, to cycle nutrients back into growth, faltered. Without those quiet caretakers, recovery grew even harder. The dominoes fell in patterns that spiraled out of control. Amphibians perished in rivers, which weakened the predators that had fed on them. Those predators then disappeared, leaving other prey unchecked. But the prey had no food either, and so they vanished too. The interconnections that had once made ecosystems stable now made their destruction absolute. The collapse was not simply one blow, but a cascade of blows, each one magnifying the next. The fossil record reflects this chain reaction. It shows not only the loss of species, but the loss of entire communities all at once. Coral reefs, which had hosted countless species, vanished suddenly, leaving behind barren layers of rock where once there had been abundance. Wetlands filled with amphibians and insects disappear together, leaving gaps where once there had been dense diversity. Predatory reptiles vanish alongside their prey, a sign that starvation echoed across food webs. The losses do not stand alone. They fall like dominoes pressed against each other, one pulling the next into silence. This interwoven collapse also explains why recovery after the Great Dying took so long. It was not enough for one survivor to endure. For ecosystems to return, multiple strands had to be rewoven. Plants needed insects, herbivores needed plants, predators needed prey, decomposers needed waste, and all needed stable conditions. With so many pieces missing, the Earth remained barren for millions of years, struggling to rebuild its broken web. Imagine walking through this unraveling world. A valley once alive with sounds is quiet. The forest is gone, so the herbivores are gone, so the predators are gone. Even the insects that buzzed in swarms are missing. You can sense the absence not just in what is gone, but in how everything is connected. Each empty niche is not isolated, but tied to many others, 1,000 unseen dominoes that toppled together. The Great Dying was not a single strike, not a lone tragedy, but the collapse of interconnection itself. Once the first dominoes fell, there was no return. The fall became inevitable, sweeping through land, sea, and sky until silence spread across the earth. And while the dominoes tumbled, the question of time loomed. How fast did this collapse happen? Was it a sudden blow or a series of cascading failures stretched over generations? The rocks, the fossils, and the chemistry of the earth carry clues, suggesting an answer hidden in the pacing of the destruction. When we imagine extinction, we often think of suddenness, a flash in the sky, an impact, a single day when everything changes. For the dinosaurs, it was a blow delivered in moments, a great asteroid strike that turned the earth dark within hours. But the great dying of the late Permian does not fit neatly into such a picture. Its story is more complicated, its timeline more uncertain. Scientists still ask, was it a swift collapse that swept life away in a blink of geological time, or was it a long unraveling stretched over hundreds of thousands of years, with multiple pulses of destruction that brought the world to its knees little by little? The fossil record suggests both possibilities, and that tension is part of what makes this extinction so haunting. In some places, rocks show a sharp boundary. Below the line, fossils are abundant, species crowding every niche. Above it, emptiness. This looks like suddenness, a moment when ecosystems collapsed all at once. Yet in other regions, the evidence points to a staggered decline. Certain groups vanish earlier, others linger for a time, fading away across hundreds of thousands of years. The extinction may not have been a single blow, but a series of strikes, each one weakening the survivors until there was almost nothing left. The pulses of destruction can be traced in the stones. Layers of ash and black shale appear, marking times when oxygen vanished from the seas. Between them, there are layers that show partial recovery, hints of life returning, only for another disaster to strike. This stop and start pattern speaks of instability, of a world lurching between fragile regrowth and renewed collapse. The Siberian Traps, erupting in waves for hundreds of thousands of years, may have driven this pattern. Each surge of lava poured more gases into the skies, each pulse of fire reshaping the climate, each new eruption adding another hammer blow to a world already cracking. For the creatures living through it, whether sudden or stretched out, the result was the same. Populations dwindled, food chains snapped, and habitats failed. Imagine an ancient forest struggling to recover after a round of fires and acid rains. For a few generations, plants regrow, insects return, and small reptiles find food once more. Then, another eruption releases gases that heat the air, poison the soils, and strip away the fragile regrowth. The forest collapses again, and this time fewer species return. With each cycle, diversity thins until the last survivors face a world too barren to sustain them. This drawn-out suffering may be one reason the Great Dying was so complete. A sudden strike like an asteroid leaves survivors that can quickly rebound once conditions stabilize. But when disasters repeat over and over, there is no stable ground for recovery. Species are not just eliminated, they are worn down. Their genetic diversity shrinks, their numbers fall too low, and even the strongest adaptations cannot withstand the relentless swings of climate and chemistry. By the time the final pulses struck, the biosphere was already too fragile to endure. From a world once vibrant with coral reefs, lush forests, swarming insects, and diverse predators, Earth slipped into near sterility. After the extinction, fossil layers show long stretches of rock almost empty of life. The seas, once crowded with ammonites, trilobites, brachiopods, and fish, became vast deserts of water. On land, great predators and herds of herbivores were replaced by a few small, hardy forms. The silence of these dead zones lasted for millions of years, an echo of how complete the collapse had been. The question of timing is still studied with intensity. Advances in dating rocks and analyzing chemical signatures continue to refine the story. Some estimates suggest the most intense phase of extinction may have happened in less than 60,000 years, which in geological terms is the blink of an eye. Others point to evidence that the entire process, from the first hints of decline to the final collapse, stretched across several 100,000 years. Either way, it remains a moment of near total erasure in Earth's long history, a fall so deep that life itself hovered on the edge of disappearing. And as the timing of the extinction continues to be unraveled, what follows in the rocks is just as telling. The evidence shows not only collapse, but also the painfully slow crawl of recovery. For millions of years after the Great Dying, life remained sparse, ecosystems shallow, as if the Earth itself was hesitant to rise again from its near death. The Great Dying was more than the loss of species, more than the disappearance of trilobites or the collapse of forests. It was a wound so deep that the very richness of life, what scientists call biodiversity, fell to its lowest point in all of Earth's long history. In the wake of those cascading disasters, the planet teetered on the edge of silence, not for days or centuries, but for millions of years. Biodiversity is the measure of variety. It is the countless forms of plants and animals, the intricate ecosystems they create, the branching tree of life with its millions of twigs and leaves. Before the Great Dying, this tree had been lush, its branches spreading in every direction, its leaves overlapping in dense abundance. After the extinction, it looked bare, stripped down to a few stubborn shoots. More than 9 out of every 10 species in the seas were gone. On land, 7 out of every 10 vanished. This was not merely a pruning, it was a near erasure, a collapse so complete that Earth, for the first time, came close to becoming a lifeless rock once more. The fossil record after the extinction reveals this emptiness with chilling clarity. In layers of stone that formed in the aftermath, fossils are few and scattered. Whole stretches of rock, representing hundreds of thousands of years, contain almost nothing. Where earlier layers were crowded with shells, bones, and imprints of plants, these are barren, as though the seas and lands had been abandoned. Scientists call them dead zones, but they are more than absence. They are echoes of a silence that lasted for ages, a silence where life itself seemed hesitant to return. For millions of years, recovery was painfully slow. After previous extinctions, ecosystems had often rebounded within a few 100,000 years. New species rose, old niches were filled, and diversity bloomed again. But after the Great Dying, the Earth staggered. Entire groups that had vanished, such as trilobites and rugose corals, never returned. Reefs, once the bustling cities of the seas, did not reappear for nearly 5 million years. The oceans remained barren plains, dominated only by a few small hardy forms that could tolerate heat, low oxygen, and poisoned waters. The once vibrant food webs were stripped down to their bare bones, functioning at the edge of collapse. On land, the picture was no brighter. Vast stretches of Pangaea were empty of large animals. Forests were sparse, reduced to scattered patches of conifers and seed ferns struggling to grow in depleted soils. Insects, once diverse and abundant, dwindled to a handful of resilient groups. For more than 5 million years, the land remained a desolate canvas, a shadow of what it had been. The great predators were gone, the herds of herbivores gone, the chorus of insects silenced. The earth that remained was a pale reflection of its former self. Imagine standing on that world in the early Triassic, after the great dying had done its work. You might look out across a valley where once there had been forests alive with sound and movement. Instead, you would see scrubby plants clinging to rocky soil, a few scattered creatures moving slowly, no great herds, no rich canopy, no buzzing insects. By a river's edge, you might find a handful of small reptiles or amphibians, but the waters themselves would look empty. The silence would not be total, but it would be thin, stretched across the landscape like a fragile veil. It was not only diversity that had been stripped away, the very roles within ecosystems were broken. Decomposers that recycle waste were fewer, slowing the return of nutrients to the soil. Herbivores were scarce, leaving many plants unbrowsed but also underpollinated. Predators had little to hunt. Each niche that had once been filled was left vacant, and with so many gaps, the machinery of life moved sluggishly, barely keeping itself alive. This long near-death state is why scientists sometimes describe the Great Dying not as an extinction, but as Earth's closest brush with sterility. The planet itself seemed hollowed out. Diversity fell so low that had a few more threads been cut, life might not have recovered at all. The survivors carried the weight of the future, each small population holding the fragile hope of millions of years to come. Yet even in this hollowed world, recovery slowly began to flicker. Certain species, like the stocky Lystrosaurus, became widespread, filling gaps left behind by others. In the seas, small bivalves endured, spreading across barren ocean floors. These were the faint first shoots of regrowth, tiny green sparks in a gray landscape, but they could not yet rebuild what had been lost. The earth remained, for ages, a near empty shell of itself, carrying only the faintest echo of the vibrancy it had once known. And as life faltered in this weakened state, the slow work of evolution pressed onward. Out of the silence, new creatures would one day emerge, stepping into the vacancies left behind. From the survivors of this near death would come the seeds of an entirely new world, and with time, the rise of new rulers who would reshape the earth again. After the great dying had hollowed the earth into silence, the planet lingered in a state that seemed almost sterile. Yet even in this emptiness, life was not gone completely. A few survivors clung on, scattered across the land and seas, and in the desolate aftermath, they began to step slowly into the void left behind. Evolution did not stop during this quiet age. It continued its patient work, shaping the creatures that remained, urging them to adapt, and in doing so, it set the stage for the rebirth of life. The world they inherited was nothing like the vibrant Permian landscape that had existed before. Forests were stripped down to stumps and scrub, rivers carried poison instead of nourishment, and the oceans were still shallow deserts of water, barren compared to their former abundance. Most of the great predators and grazers were gone. The ecological roles that had once been filled by thousands of species were now empty, and it was into this emptiness that the survivors expanded. On land, one creature in particular came to dominate: Lystrosaurus. This stocky, tusked reptile, distant kin of the line that would one day give rise to mammals, proved to be the ultimate survivor. Its body was not graceful, nor was it especially fearsome. With a barrel-shaped chest, short legs, and a blunt face tipped with a beak-like mouth, it was unremarkable compared to the saber-toothed predators and armored reptiles that had vanished. Yet in a shattered world, unremarkable traits became extraordinary. Lystrosaurus was small enough to need little food, yet sturdy enough to travel across harsh landscapes. It dug burrows into the soil, hiding from the heat and finding shelter where others could not. It fed on tough plants that many other herbivores could not digest, scraping nourishment from roots and stems that clung to life in poor soils. And perhaps most importantly, it reproduced quickly, ensuring that even when individuals died in large numbers, enough young survived to carry the lineage forward. In the desolate Triassic landscape, Lystrosaurus spread far and wide, from South Africa to Russia to China, filling the empty spaces with staggering success. For a time, nearly 9 out of every 10 land animals were Lystrosaurus. In a world emptied of giants, this humble burrower became the ruler. The seas also found their survivors. Bivalves and gastropods, simple shell-bearing creatures, endured in the shallow waters. They were not spectacular, but they were adaptable, able to withstand fluctuating oxygen levels and changing chemistry. Certain fishes managed to cling on as well, though in far smaller numbers than before. Microbial communities, thriving in conditions that would have destroyed more complex organisms, played a crucial role in recycling nutrients and keeping ecosystems functioning at a basic level. These small forms, overlooked in times of abundance, became the foundation upon which new marine food chains would slowly rebuild. Other land survivors carved their place in the barren landscapes. Small insect groups endured, feeding on decaying matter and helping plants recover. Early reptiles, some no larger than a human hand, began to experiment with new ecological roles, filling niches once held by creatures far larger. With each passing generation, survivors adapted further, and evolution nudged them into forms that could thrive in a changed world. The rebirth of life was not a sudden flowering. It was a slow, halting process, like a faint heartbeat returning to a body that had nearly stilled. Ecosystems remained fragile for millions of years, vulnerable to setbacks, but little by little, green returned to the land and motion returned to the seas. Each adaptation, each new lineage, was a step away from the silence of extinction and toward the resurgence of diversity. The dominance of creatures like Lystrosaurus reminds us of the power of resilience. Survival did not belong to the strongest or the most ferocious, but to the adaptable. It was the ability to eat what others could not, to hide when the world grew too harsh, to reproduce quickly and endure scarcity that carried life through its darkest chapter. These traits may not inspire awe, but they carried the promise of the future. And in that future, the survivors would continue to diversify from the lineages that endured the Great Dying. New reptiles would rise, filling the roles of predators and grazers once again. The world was resetting itself, slowly, painfully, but with determination. Evolution was stepping into the void, shaping the earth not into what it had been, but into something new. From near sterility, life began to stir again. From silence, a faint chorus returned. And though the earth would never look the same as it had before the Great Dying, the seeds of its rebirth had been planted. The survivors were already moving down paths that would one day lead to entirely new rulers of the land and sea, waiting for their moment. As the first fragile signs of recovery took root after the Great Dying, the world that emerged was not the same as the one that had come before. Entire lineages were gone, entire ecosystems erased, and in that emptiness, new opportunities opened. Evolution does not stop, even in the aftermath of catastrophe. It adapts, it reshapes, it redirects. And from the survivors of this near-sterile Earth, a new chapter began to unfold, one that would eventually lead to the rise of the most iconic rulers the planet has ever known, the dinosaurs. The early Triassic landscape, born out of silence, was one of experimentation. With so many niches left vacant, survivors expanded in unusual directions. Lystrosaurus, the humble burrower that had become the most common animal on land, dominated in vast numbers, but its reign was a temporary one. Evolution was already preparing new forms to take its place. Small reptiles, some no larger than a human arm, began to diversify into strange new shapes. Some stretched their limbs longer, giving them speed on open ground. Others strengthened their jaws, adapting to crush the tough plants that now dominated the barren soils. Each adaptation carved a new pathway in the great tree of life. Among these early reptiles were the ancestors of creatures that would eventually branch into the great archosaurs. Archosaurs, meaning ruling reptiles, were a group that included crocodile-like hunters, bird-like forms, and most famously, the line that would become dinosaurs. In the early Triassic, they were still small, nimble creatures, competing with other reptilian survivors for space and food. But in a world of instability, their adaptability gave them an edge. They were lighter, quicker, and more flexible in their habits than many of their competitors. As the Triassic age progressed, the balance of power shifted. Many of the mammal-like reptiles, the therapsids, never recovered their former glory. Once dominant predators and grazers, they remained only in a few modest forms, their diversity permanently reduced by the catastrophe. This opened the way for reptiles to step forward. The archosaurs, in particular, began to spread into roles once held by others. Some evolved into powerful land predators, others into swift herbivores, and still others adapted to semi-aquatic lives along rivers and lakes. The world was beginning to fill again, but it was filling with new rulers. Imagine standing in the Middle Triassic, perhaps 20 million years after the extinction. The land is no longer silent, though it is far from as rich as it once was. Small forests are growing again. Insects buzz faintly in the air, and herds of reptilian grazers move cautiously across the open plains. Among them stalk the first true archosaur predators, sleek and agile, jaws lined with sharp teeth. They are not yet dinosaurs, but they are their forerunners, testing the adaptations that would one day carry their descendants to dominance. By the late Triassic, around 30 million years after the Great Dying, the first dinosaurs truly appear. At first, they are not giants. They are slender, two-legged hunters, some no larger than a dog, darting quickly through forests and across plains. They live in the shadows of other archosaurs, competing with large crocodile-like relatives that still hold much of the power. But in their speed, their upright posture, and their efficient lungs, the dinosaurs carried advantages that would soon prove decisive. The Great Dying had cleared the stage. The extinction had swept aside the great therapsid predators, the armored herbivores, the sprawling amphibians that once ruled the rivers. Into that emptiness, the dinosaurs began to rise. Over millions of years, they would grow from small, nimble hunters into the giants of the Jurassic and Cretaceous, filling every role from massive long-necked grazers to towering carnivores. Their rule would last for more than 160 million years, far longer than humans have yet existed. And though the dinosaurs are remembered as the mighty rulers of their time, their dominance was born not in power, but in survival. They rose because others had fallen. They thrived because the Great Dying had reset the earth, clearing away the ancient order and giving space to something new. Their story is inseparable from the catastrophe that came before, the silence that gave them room to step forward. The road to dinosaurs was not a straight line, nor was it quick. It was a slow expansion, a steady filling of empty niches, a patient climb out of the shadows of extinction. But once they rose, they would shape the earth in ways no group before them had managed, becoming the symbol of an age rebuilt from ruin. And as the dinosaurs began their ascent, the story of the Great Dying faded into deep time, its lessons buried in stone. Yet for us, those lessons still echo, reminding us of the razor-thin margin that separates collapse from survival and how new life can grow from even the darkest of voids. The story of the Great Dying may feel like a distant chapter, locked away more than 250 million years in the past, but it is not a tale we can leave only to history. When we trace the scars left in stone, when we read the chemical signatures of poisoned seas and overheated skies, we are also looking at patterns that echo uneasily in our world today. The extinction that almost erased life is not just a record of catastrophe, it is a warning, and one that feels uncomfortably close. One of the clearest parallels lies in the chemistry of the oceans. During the Great Dying, enormous amounts of carbon dioxide poured into the atmosphere from the eruptions of the Siberian Traps. Much of that carbon dissolved into the seas, lowering their pH and turning them acidic. Shell-forming creatures, from corals to tiny plankton, struggled to build their protective armor. Without those foundations, food webs collapsed, cascading upward into extinction. Today, we are seeing the beginnings of a similar process. Human activity releases billions of tons of carbon dioxide every year, and more than 1/3 of it is absorbed by the oceans. As a result, modern seas are already more acidic than they have been for millions of years. Coral reefs are bleaching, plankton are stressed, and the same foundations of marine life that once crumbled during the Great Dying are beginning to show signs of weakness again. The climate itself also holds an unsettling mirror. The greenhouse gases released by the Siberian Traps superheated the planet, raising average temperatures by more than 10 degrees Celsius. Entire regions near the equator became lethal zones, too hot for large animals to survive. Today, our world has already warmed by more than 1 degree Celsius since the Industrial Revolution, and if carbon emissions continue unchecked, models predict increases of 3, 4, or even more degrees in the coming centuries. For us, that difference is the span between familiar seasons and extremes we have never endured. For ecosystems, it is the difference between adaptation and collapse. Another warning comes from instability. During the Great Dying, the climate did not shift smoothly. It lurched, swinging between volcanic winters and blazing summers. That unpredictability made survival nearly impossible. Today, we see hints of our own climate's instability. Stronger storms, longer droughts, harsher floods. While not identical, the pattern is familiar. Rapid, unpredictable change pushes species and systems beyond their limits, and even the most adaptable struggle when the rhythm of the planet is broken. Scientists studying the Great Dying often emphasize that it was not a single cause that made it so deadly, but the combination of many stressors at once. Heat alone might not have done it. Acid rain alone might not have done it. Poisoned rivers, toxic oceans, and starvation alone might not have done it. But together, layered one atop another, they overwhelmed the resilience of life. Today, we see a similar layering. Habitat loss, pollution, warming seas, acidification, overfishing, deforestation, each is a stress in itself, but combined, they amplify one another. This is why many scientists warn that we may be living in the early stages of a sixth mass extinction. Could humanity trigger its own Great Dying? The answer is not certain, but the possibility is not distant science fiction. We already see species vanishing at rates far above natural background levels. Amphibians are disappearing from polluted and warming wetlands. Insects, the quiet architects of ecosystems, are declining in alarming numbers. Coral reefs, once the rainforests of the seas, may vanish entirely within a century. Each loss is a thread cut, and as the story of the Permian shows us, once enough threads are severed, the whole web begins to collapse. Yet the great dying also offers another lesson, one less dire but just as important. Life is resilient. Even when reduced to its smallest, most hidden forms, it endured. From that fragile survival came recovery, came dinosaurs, came mammals, came eventually us. The Earth itself will survive whatever we do, reshaping and rebuilding over millions of years if needed. The question is not whether life will endure, but whether we, and the world we know, will endure with it. The warning written in stone tells us this. The Earth has already shown what happens when balance is broken, when heat, poison, and instability converge. It does not happen slowly. It does not happen gently. It comes as a chain of dominoes, and once they fall, there is no easy return. That is why the story of the great dying matters now more than ever. It is not only a memory of a time when the world nearly ended, it is a glimpse of what could happen again if we are not careful. And as we hold that warning in mind, we turn to the most fragile and profound truth of all. Every tree, every bird, every person alive today owes its existence to the slim margin of survival that carried life through the great dying. Our own story is born from catastrophe endured, and that alone should remind us of how precious and precarious this gift of existence truly is. When we look back at the great dying, it is easy to be overwhelmed by the scale of loss. Entire forests erased, oceans emptied of their creatures, predators and prey alike vanishing in silence. Yet, within that devastation lies the seed of something astonishing, because every bird that takes flight today, every fish that swims, every tree that shades the earth, every human being alive, all trace their existence back to the tiny fraction of life that somehow endured the catastrophe. We are not separate from that story. We are its continuation. The survivors were few, scattered across a broken planet. They were not the mighty rulers of their age, but the overlooked, the adaptable, the ones that hid in burrows or clung to scraps of food when all else failed. Creatures like Lystrosaurus trudged through barren landscapes, while small bivalves burrowed into shallow seabeds. Insects crawled through the debris of charred forests, microbes thrived in chemical-laced waters, and seeds clung stubbornly to lifeless soils. They did not know they were carrying the torch of existence, yet they did. Without them, the chain of life would have ended, and there would be no us to look back on the story. That is what makes the survival of life both inspiring and terrifying. Inspiring because it shows that even in the face of unimaginable destruction, life refuses to vanish entirely. Terrifying because the margin between survival and annihilation was so thin. If a few more degrees of heat had scorched the planet, if a few more pulses of poison had tipped the balance, if the survivors had been just slightly fewer, the story could have ended differently. Earth might have been stripped bare, a planet where silence reigned not for millions of years, but forever. Think of how fragile that thread was. Out of the countless species that once lived in the late Permian, 9 out of 10 in the seas and 7 out of 10 on land were gone. What remained was barely enough to hold the fabric of ecosystems together. For millions of years afterward, biodiversity hovered at its lowest, like an echo of near sterility. Yet from that whisper, from that handful of resilient forms, life rebuilt itself, patiently, step by step. The dinosaurs, the mammals, the birds, the flowers, even the first humans, all of them grew from that razor-thin survival. It is a reminder that existence is not guaranteed. Every creature alive today is the product of chance stacked upon chance, of survival against odds stretching back billions of years. The fact that Earth is alive at all is remarkable, given how often the balance has been broken, and the fact that we exist, able to reflect on that story, is perhaps the most fragile gift of all. There is a strange humility in knowing that our roots stretch back to those survivors. We are not descended from the towering predators or the rulers of ancient seas. Our ancestry flows through the small, the adaptable, the ones who found a way to endure when the world crumbled. The gift they carried was not glory, but persistence, and it was enough. To stand under a tree today, or to listen to birdsong at dawn, is to stand in the presence of resilience. Every leaf and feather is a descendant of those that scraped through the great dying. To watch a fish dart through the water or a mammal nurse its young is to see continuity, a fragile chain unbroken through fire, poison, heat, and silence. The diversity we take for granted is a tapestry woven from survivors' threads, each one stretched across deep time. And yet, within that resilience lies a warning. The great dying shows us how thin the line is, how close Earth once came to being a barren rock. The razor's edge between survival and extinction is not ancient history. It exists still in the decisions we make, in the pressures we place on ecosystems, in the balance we hold with climate and oceans. What endured before may endure again, but there is no guarantee that humans, or the world as we know it, would be among the survivors. The fragile gift of existence is both comfort and caution. Comfort, because it tells us that life is astonishingly persistent, that even from ruins it can rise again. Caution, because it tells us that nothing, not even the richest and most abundant world, is immune to collapse. We live not outside that truth, but inside it, carried forward on the survival of creatures that clung on when the earth itself seemed finished. And as we carry that fragile gift, we must ask ourselves what we will do with it. For the story of the great dying has one more chapter still to unfold, not in stone or fossil, but in the way we choose to live now, as heirs of survival. The great dying was not only a story of endings, it was also a story of beginnings. Though it carries the shadow of the darkest chapter in Earth's history, it also holds the quiet truth that life is stubborn, that it finds ways to rise again, even when the odds seem impossible. Out of unimaginable loss came the fragile seeds of future life, seeds that would grow into new forests, new oceans full of creatures, and eventually into us. When we look back across that deep time, what we see is not just the erasure of a world, but the resilience of the few who endured. Lystrosaurus, trudging across barren plains, small-shelled creatures burrowed in shallow waters, microbes clinging to toxic pools, none of them knew they were carrying the weight of all that would follow. And yet, without their survival, there would be no birds in the skies, no mammals on the land, no humans to reflect on the story. Every breath we take is a continuation of their fragile victory. The great dying reminds us that extinction is not an abstract idea. It is real, it is devastating, and it shapes the course of life for millions of years. But it also shows us that death and rebirth are woven together. What vanished cleared the way for what was to come. The fall of ancient giants gave rise to the age of dinosaurs. Their eventual fall gave rise to mammals, and from mammals, in time, came us. We are here because life refused to let go, even when the planet itself seemed to turn against it. Yet this story is not only about the past, it carries questions that echo into our present and future. If Earth were to face such a crisis again, could we survive it? Could our species endure if the oceans turned acidic, if the skies grew red with heat, if ecosystems unraveled faster than they could recover? The fossil record shows how thin the line between survival and extinction truly is. The creatures that endured did not always do so through strength or power, but through adaptability, resilience, and sometimes sheer chance. For humanity, the challenge would be no less. The razor-thin margin that spared life before is the same margin that exists today. Our world is changing. The air is warming. The seas are rising. Ecosystems are fraying under the pressure of our presence. The parallels to the past are not exact, but they are unsettling. And if the Great Dying teaches us anything, it is that once the dominoes of collapse begin to fall, they are almost impossible to stop. Still, there is a profound comfort in knowing that life, even reduced to its smallest sparks, can rise again. The resilience of Earth is awe-inspiring, but it should also remind us of our responsibility. Because while the Earth may heal over millions of years, we live on a much shorter time scale. For us, for our children, for the living world we know today, the choices we make now will decide whether our story is one of survival or silence. As you rest tonight, let this thought settle gently with you. Every tree, every bird, every person exists because life endured its darkest trial. The Great Dying was not only death, it was rebirth. It was a reminder that even from ashes, new worlds can grow. And so too, in our time, we have the power to shape what survives us, what endures beyond us, and what kind of future takes root from the choices we leave behind. If this journey through Earth's deadliest day has stirred something in you, I would be honored if you gave this video a gentle like, or even subscribed if you would like to join me for more of these quiet explorations into the mysteries of science and survival. And if you have a moment, share this story with someone who might wonder, as you did tonight, how close the Earth has come to silence, and how miraculous it is that life continues still. In the comments, I would love to hear your thoughts. Do you believe humanity could endure if the Earth faced another great dying? Or would we, too, become one more vanished branch on the tree of life? For now, let your breath deepen, let your shoulders soften, and let the vastness of this story wrap around you. Out of endings come beginnings, out of silence comes song, out of death, life. And in that, we find not only history, but hope.